Alina Monroe hadn't eaten lunch in 3 months, and nobody at the Meridian, Chicago's most expensive restaurant, had ever noticed. Every single day, the 27-year-old waitress carried $4,000 bottles of wine to people who never once looked at her face, while her own stomach growled beneath her pressed uniform, because the one staff meal the restaurant gave her each afternoon wasn't lunch to Alina, it was dinner. Wrapped in foil and hidden in her locker, the only food she'd taste all day, and every dollar she didn't spend went straight to the $60,000 of her late mother's hospital debt that her aunt held over her head like a blade, along with something far more precious: the last boxes of her dead mother's belongings, held hostage until every cent was paid. Work, skip lunch, pay the debt, keep mom's things. That was her whole life until one freezing March afternoon, when she carried the trash out to the alley and saw her. An old woman sat motionless against the cold brick wall across the street, thin as a shadow, her coat worn through at the elbows, clutching a faded photograph wrapped in plastic, like it was the only thing keeping her alive. She wasn't begging. She wasn't asking anyone for anything. She just sat there in the bitter wind, while hundreds of people in $1,000 shoes walked past her like she didn't exist until the restaurant manager stormed out and screamed at her to get away from his customers. And the old woman flinched like she'd been struck, and Alina broke, exhausted, invisible in her own way, did something nobody on that street had done since that fateful tragedy. She stopped. She crossed the road, knelt down on the wet concrete, went back inside, took her one and only meal out of that locker, and pressed it into those trembling hands, still warm. "Eat something, ma'am, please. Sit down first, you look weak." She did it again the next day, and the day after that. 3 days, 3 meals. One lonely young woman giving a stranger the very thing she needed most herself. But Alina had no idea that this simple act of compassion was about to pull her into a dangerous world. She couldn't possibly know that this ragged old woman wasn't homeless at all, but the matriarch of an empire, and that her sudden disappearance had just triggered a silent panic across the dark underbelly of Chicago. As powerful men prepared to tear the city apart to find her, a penniless waitress's life was about to change forever. Why was the richest mother in Chicago sitting on a freezing sidewalk in rags? Why did she clutch that photograph like a wound that never healed? And what happens to a penniless waitress when the most dangerous family in America decides she matters? If this story's already got its hooks in you, smash that like button right now. Share this video with someone who still believes kindness can change a life. And subscribe to the channel, because stories like this one drop every week and you don't want to miss what happens next. Now, let's go back to that alley behind the Meridian, where a hungry young waitress is about to hand a stranger her last warm meal and change both their lives forever. True to her routine, Alina had spent the last 2 evenings slipping out of the restaurant's back door to share her only warm meal with the mysterious old woman, even braving the furious threats of her manager, Gordon Ames, who despised seeing a homeless stranger near his establishment. But by the 3rd night, the bitter Chicago wind had risen violently, and a freezing rain slashed sideways through the dark alley. When Alina ran across the road with a fresh foil container hidden beneath her coat, she found the old woman shivering uncontrollably against the brick wall, her lips pale, her forehead burning beneath Alina's palm. "You have a fever. You can't stay out here tonight," Alina said, her voice filled with sudden determination. The old woman weakly looked up. "I've survived worse nights than this. I don't care," Alina replied softly, pulling the stranger close. "Come home with me. My apartment is tiny, but it's warm. There's hot water and fresh soup. Please." The old woman studied her for a very long time, her ash-gray eyes searching Alina's face for any hidden motive, but she found nothing except pure, uncalculated kindness. "You don't know who I am," the woman hoarsely whispered. "I know you're cold. Tonight, that's enough." With a slow nod, the elderly woman placed her frail hand in Alina's. Alina draped her only coat over the woman's trembling shoulders and guided her toward the bus stop just as the rain turned heavy. Neither of them looked back, completely unaware that a mere 4 minutes later, 3 black SUVs would tear through that exact corner of our West Randolph, their headlights illuminating nothing but an empty sidewalk and an abandoned foil container. A broad-shouldered man stepped out into the pouring rain, speaking urgently into a radio. Reporting to the boss, "The old lady is gone." We're one step too late. Alina's studio apartment was on the 3rd floor of an old brick building in Pilsen, where the water pipes groaned every night, and the heater had to be struck twice before it would agree to work. But when she opened the door and turned on the light, the old woman stood in the middle of that small room in silence for a long while, as though she had stepped into a place far larger than the four walls before her. "It's truly warm," she said softly. Alina spread fresh blankets over the only twin bed and carried a pillow to the sofa for herself, and despite the old woman's protests, she only smiled. "I'm used to sleeping on the sofa. When the springs squeak, that's their way of singing me a lullaby." The next morning she awoke to the smell of coffee, and found that the old woman had been up for some time. The blanket on the bed had been folded into a perfect square, every corner sharp as the edge of a box, so neat and precise that it looked like a hotel bed. The strange little detail drifted briefly through Alina's mind, then dissolved beneath the weight of her sleepiness. "My name is Mena," the old woman said, placing a cup of coffee on the table, her back perfectly straight on the rickety wooden chair, her shoulders showing none of the sagging weariness of someone accustomed to sleeping on the street. "Just Mena. That's enough. I'm Alina Monroe. I know. You've been wearing a name tag for 3 days." And for the first time, Alina saw the corner of her mouth lift into a genuine smile. That afternoon, when Alina carried a bag of laundry to the laundromat on the corner, she found a folded stack of money lying beside the clothes Mina had just changed out of, exactly $200, worn but carefully flattened. Her heart gave a hard beat. $200 meant 3 weeks of groceries. It was nearly enough to cover one interest payment to Aunt Darlene. She stood there amid the roar of the dryers, holding money that someone had lost, someone who might need it every bit as badly as she did. That evening, Mina watched her carefully writing something on a piece of paper, and the following day, a neatly handwritten notice appeared on the bulletin board beside the laundromat's change machine. A sum of cash had been found Wednesday afternoon. Anyone who had lost it should describe the exact amount and the way it had been folded, then contact Alina at the phone number below. "You found money?" Mena asked casually as she stood near the pot of soup. "Yes, someone must have dropped it while folding their clothes. Losing that much money would hurt. Why didn't you keep it?" "No one would ever know. I would know," Lena said simply as she ladled soup into 2 mismatched bowls. "That's already one person too many." Mena said nothing. She only lowered her head and ate, and Alina didn't see those ash-gray eyes close for one quiet second, like someone finally setting down a heavy stone. Nor did she notice that this homeless old woman held her fork with 3 precise fingers, the way silverware was handled in banquet halls, or that she ate with her back never once touching the chair, or that when she finished, she placed her spoon and fork diagonally across the bowl in exactly the same manner as the wealthiest guests at the Meridian. 3 nights later, well past midnight, Alina woke with a start at the sound of a faint moan and found Mena curled up on the bed, one hand clutching her chest, her face twisted in pain. "What's wrong?" "Mena, where does it hurt?" "My chest, it feels so tight." "I'm sure it's nothing. Go back to sleep, child." "What do you mean, it's nothing?" Alina was already on her feet, wrapping a scarf around Mena and pulling on her shoes. "We're going to the hospital." "No. Hospitals cost too much. I don't have insurance and you don't have money." Alina froze for exactly 1 second, then pulled Mena's arm over her shoulder. "There's a free clinic on Ashland Street, about a 15-minute walk from here. Hold on to me. We'll go slowly." And so they went through the bitter Chicago cold at 3 in the morning, the young woman supporting the old one, through every pool of streetlight, talking about anything and everything to distract her from the pain. In the crowded waiting room of the free clinic, Alina sat upright for 4 hours on a hard plastic chair, letting Mena rest her head against her shoulder and fall asleep, while her hand never released the old woman's for even a single minute. Near dawn, a nurse called them in, checked Mina's blood pressure, listened to her heart, then said that all her vital signs were normal, and that the pain was most likely muscle strain caused by the cold. "Thank goodness," Alina breathed, dark circles beneath her eyes even as she smiled. "You scared me half to death. You've been awake all night. And you still have an afternoon shift. I can sleep on the bus. I'm an expert at sleeping on buses." Throughout the ride home, Mina said very little. She only glanced from time to time at the pale, exhausted yet peaceful face of the young woman beside her, with the gaze of someone adding figures to a ledger. But on the 3rd morning of their life together, every calculation she had made turned in a direction no one could have foreseen. Alina was frying eggs when the smell of hot oil rose into the air, and suddenly she dropped the spatula, covered her mouth with one hand, and rushed into the bathroom, the sound of her retching carrying through the thin door. "Are you all right?" Mina asked, knocking softly. "I'm fine. I think I must have eaten something that upset my stomach." But it was the second time in 3 mornings, and Mena's eyes had already begun sweeping across the room like a silent radar, passing over the package of saltine crackers beside the sofa pillow, then the bottle of ginger water in the refrigerator, small pieces gradually arranging themselves into a picture she had seen 3 times during her years as a mother. That afternoon, after Alina left for work, Mena changed the trash bag in the bathroom, and from the bottom of the wastebasket, wrapped in a piece of toilet paper, a small white plastic stick slipped free and landed face up on the tile floor. The 2 pink lines had faded, but they were still unmistakably clear. Mena stood motionless for a very long time, the old pregnancy test lying at her feet, the clock ticking against the wall, and behind those ash-gray eyes, some unseen door had just closed, colder than it had ever been before. That evening, Alina came home carrying a container of leftovers from the restaurant kitchen and wearing a tired smile. But the moment she stepped through the door, she stopped. Mena was sitting perfectly upright on the wooden chair in the middle of the room. The lights were off, and on the table, directly beneath the pale glow of the street lamp filtering through the window, lay the white plastic test with its 2 faded pink lines. Neither of them spoke for 10 seconds. "How long were you planning to hide this from me?" Mena's voice wasn't loud, but it was as cold as a stone countertop. "I wasn't hiding it. It wasn't time to say anything yet. It wasn't time." She repeated the words slowly. "How old are you?" 27, no husband, no ring. You work as a server, you're drowning in debt, you live in a room barely 430 square feet, and you're carrying a child with no father. Where is he? I don't know. You don't know." Mina closed her eyes for 1 second, and when she opened them again, her gaze was sharp as a razor. "Then either you were foolish or you were calculating. Was this child an accident? Or is it a ticket you plan to use to get something from some man?" The question struck like a slap, and Alina felt her eyes begin to burn, but she didn't lower them. She placed the food container on the table, pulled out a chair, and sat across from the old woman, her back every bit as straight. "You want the truth, then I'll tell you the truth. I met him for 1 night. I don't know his last name. I don't know what he does. I don't know what city in this world he's in now. I only know one thing. This baby is mine. I'll raise this child with these 2 hands. I won't ask anyone for a single dollar, and I won't demand responsibility from anyone, not even the father, even if I find him someday. You can think whatever you want about me, but don't call my child a ticket." Mina watched her for a long time, then turned her face toward the window, and the interrogation ended there. There was no reconciliation, no embrace, only 2 women eating dinner in silence while an invisible wall rose between them inside the little room. That night, Alina lay awake on the sofa, staring into the darkness, and the memory found its own way back to her, like snow melting upward into the sky. 3 months earlier, on a night in the middle of December, Chicago had been buried beneath the worst snowstorm of the winter. The buses had stopped running, and Alina was walking home close to 1 o'clock in the morning, snow reaching her ankles, the wind crying through the alleys like someone in grief. She heard him before she saw him, a heavy, labored breath coming from the corner of the alley behind the laundromat. Beneath the sickly yellow glow of a street lamp, a man sat slumped against the wall, snow gathering white across the shoulders of a black wool coat that Alina could tell with 1 glance cost more than she earned in an entire year. But what made her freeze was the dark stain spreading across his left shoulder, soaking through the fabric and dripping onto the snow in small black drops. "My God, you're hurt! Let me call an ambulance!" His hand seized her wrist with astonishing speed for a man losing blood, and when he lifted his eyes to hers, they were dark and frighteningly alert within his pale face. "No hospital. No police. Please, are you insane? You're bleeding. It's only a cut. Please." His voice had turned hoarse, and there was something in that single plea that made Alina, who had spent her whole life distrusting strange men, do the most reckless thing she had ever done. She pulled the stranger's arm over her shoulders, helped him through 2 snow-buried blocks, up 3 flights of stairs, and into her 430-square-foot apartment. She lowered him onto this very sofa, brought out the first aid kit she had taken home from the restaurant. cut through the blood-soaked fabric of his coat, and bandaged the long gash across his shoulder, with hands that trembled but never stopped. He gritted his teeth without making a sound, watching her steadily, as though she were the most incomprehensible thing he had ever encountered. "Why are you helping me?" "Because you were about to freeze to death out there. People shouldn't need a reason not to walk past someone who's freezing to death." He remained silent for a long time, then said quietly, "Ray. You can call me Ray." That night, the storm howled beyond the windows. The heater had to be struck twice before it worked, and they shared the last bowl of hot soup. Two lonely people, one running from something and the other with nothing left to lose, found in each other a warmth neither had intended to seek, warmer than any furnace, more real than any promise, and as brief as the storm itself. By morning, the snow had stopped falling. The sofa was empty, the blanket folded neatly, and on the table sat a thick stack of cash. Alina stared at it for a long time before placing it untouched inside an envelope, because she hadn't bandaged his wound for payment. It wasn't until the following week, when she pulled the sofa away from the wall to sweep beneath it, that she found the object. A heavy silver lighter slipped from between the cushions, its surface scratched and worn, but the two engraved initials were still sharp and clear. TB. She placed it inside the cloth bag where she kept her mementos, beside her mother's costume jewelry and old letters, intending to return it if she ever saw him again. Now at 3 o'clock in the morning, Alina was sleeping deeply on the sofa, her breathing soft and even, while in the corner of the room, Mena quietly sat up. She didn't trust girls who seemed too good. 63 years of life had taught her that perfect kindness was often only a coat of paint covering a scheme, and if this girl had been sent by someone to get close to her, the proof would be hidden among the things she guarded most carefully. The cloth bag was beneath the bed. Mina opened it without making a sound, her fingers passing over a strand of plastic beads, ink-stained letters, a roll of debt notices, a thick envelope that had never been opened, and then touching something small, metallic, cold, and heavy. She lifted it into the glow of the street lamp. The world stopped. The silver lighter rested in her palm, yellow light flowing along the familiar scratch on its side, a scratch whose origin she knew herself, while the two engraved initials stared up at her like eyes from a world long buried. TB Mena's hand began to tremble. She turned it over, though she didn't need to, because she had known every millimeter of that object since before it had been given away for the final time, on a day filled with rain and white flowers. Her aged fingers closed around the cold silver, tightening until her knuckles turned white, and Mena sat there in the darkness for a very long time, staring through the sleeping girl, through the thin blanket lying across the still flat curve of her stomach, where a tiny heartbeat was growing stronger with every passing day, a heartbeat carrying blood she had believed she would never again be allowed to hold in her arms. She didn't wake Alina. She said nothing. She returned the lighter to exactly where she had found it, closed the cloth bag, pushed it beneath the bed, then lay down and stared at the ceiling until morning. From that moment on, inside that 430-square-foot room, there were 2 women and 3 secrets, but only one of them knew all 3. The next morning, Alina woke and thought she was still dreaming, because the room smelled of eggs fried in butter and toasted bread, while Mena, who only the night before had looked at her as though she were a defendant on trial, was standing beside the stove in an apron fashioned from an old bath towel, working the skillet with movements so practiced they were almost impossible to believe. "Sit down and eat. Eggs have to be eaten while they're hot. You cooked for me?" "Who else would I be cooking for?" "The refrigerator." "Sit." There was also a glass of milk filled to the brim on the table, and when Alina had taken only one sip and tried to stand, Mena's thin hand pressed her firmly back into the chair. "Finish it. You've been pale as a leaf lately. Eating the way you do, how are you supposed to stand for 10 hours a day? But yesterday you were. Yesterday was yesterday." Mena cut her off, her eyes never leaving the skillet, though her voice suddenly softened in a way Alina couldn't explain. "I'm old. Sometimes I say more than I should. Don't take it to heart." From that day forward, the climate inside the little room changed completely. Mina washed and hung the clothes to dry, simmered chicken soup and made Alina take it to work, and every night at exactly 9:30, she forced her to drink a second glass of milk. On nights when Alina came home late, Mina even left the hallway light on and sat waiting beside the window. Alina stared at the change in bewilderment. like someone receiving a gift without knowing the reason. Whenever she asked, Mina only shrugged. Old people change their moods the way Chicago changes its wind. Why bother wondering? But there were moments when Alina caught her watching from behind, her gaze lingering for a very long time, on the place where Alina's hand unconsciously rested over her stomach, with an expression so tender and wounded that Alina couldn't begin to understand it. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, after 9 days of turning Chicago upside down, William's men finally found a trace of her through a traffic camera at the corner of West Randolph. The grainy footage showed a girl in a restaurant uniform helping an old woman onto the number 8 bus headed toward Pilsen. That night, close to 1 o'clock in the morning, Alina had just changed out of her work clothes after the evening shift when the apartment door shook beneath 3 rapid blows. Before she could even ask who was there, the old lock burst apart, the door flew open, and 2 flashlight beams swept directly across the room, blinding her. A tall figure strode over the threshold and filled the doorway, his voice deep and cold enough to make the temperature in the room seem to drop several degrees. "Who are you? And what do you want from my mother?" Alina stepped back, one hand reaching blindly for the handle of the skillet on the stove, her heart pounding wildly. But beneath the fear, some hidden string inside her mind began to tremble. That deep, rough voice, the slow and heavy way he pressed each word. She had heard it somewhere before, on some night filled with the howling of wind. "Put the skillet down and answer me." The man took another step. The flashlight held by the person behind him swept upward, passed across his shoulder, then reflected back, and for half a second that weak yellow light flooded over the sharply cut face, the hard jaw, the dark eyes that were frighteningly alert, and the faint scar near his temple. The skillet slipped from Alina's hand and struck the floor with a deafening clang. "Ray?" The entire room froze. The man stopped as though turned to stone in the middle of a step, his dark eyes widening as they moved from her face to her worn pajamas, down to her trembling hands, then back up again. In that gaze which had always seemed ruled by absolute control, something fell suddenly out of order for the first time, an echo from a December night he had ordered himself to forget. "You." He didn't get the chance to finish. From the bed in the corner, an elderly voice rose calm and clear, as though its owner had merely been watching a play all along. "Well, look at that. You finally decided to come, son?" Mina sat up, twisted her hair back into place, and looked casually at the 2 people standing petrified in the middle of the room. "Alina, don't be afraid. That's my son. His name is Ray. He works security for a very wealthy man downtown, an unbelievably wealthy man. So he's always wound as tight as a violin string, kicking down other people's doors in the middle of the night without the least idea of good manners. I apologize for him, Mother." William's voice caught in his throat, his jaw clenched hard. He stared at his mother, the most powerful woman in every memory of his childhood, now sitting on a rickety twin bed in a rough cotton nightgown, playing the part of the elderly mother of a security guard. Her ash-gray eyes met his directly with a silent command he had understood since he was 6 years old. Play along or suffer the consequences. "I apologize for the door." He said each word as though it were being pulled from him with pliers. "I'll pay for it." In the hallway, Paulie Ritchie had pressed his fist against his mouth, his shoulders shaking violently. In 15 years of standing beside the man who made all of Chicago tremble, nothing in his career had ever given him a spectacle this magnificent. "Come home, Mother," William said, trying to recover some shred of control. "Home where? Home. To where you live. I am home." Mena pulled the blanket neatly over her stomach, with the finality of a judge delivering a verdict. "It's cramped, it creaks, but it's warm, and there's someone who cooks for me and waits up so I can sleep. In 6 years, these are the first 3 nights I've slept well in a row. I'm not going anywhere. Mother, this place isn't safe. Then you're here to make it safe." She lifted her chin toward the sofa. "You want to guard me? Move in and do it. That sofa is exactly 5 feet 11 inches long. It'll fit you perfectly." Alina stood in the middle of her own apartment, her eyes moving back and forth between the homeless old woman she had brought home from the sidewalk and the man from the snowstorm, now standing motionless with 2 bodyguards behind him. And she had the unmistakable feeling that her life had just turned sharply onto a road where she had never seen the warning sign. "Wait," she said weakly. "May I ask just one question? What exactly is happening here?" And in that moment, the 2 members of the Barone family, one hiding an entire empire behind the word security guard, The other, concealing a shattering truth behind a toothless smile, answered her at exactly the same time with the same sentence, as though they had rehearsed it in advance. Nothing at all. The first night of the most powerful man in Chicago, inside a 430-square-foot room, began with one physical truth that couldn't be negotiated. The sofa was exactly 5 feet 11 inches long, while he stood 6 feet 2. William lay down with his feet extending past the armrest, and when he turned onto his side, the springs released a long creak like the door of an abandoned house. From the bed, Mina's voice drifted through the darkness, sweet as honey. "Sleep well, son." He closed his eyes and thought of the custom-made bed imported from Italy in his penthouse nearly 7 miles away, and for the first time in his life, he understood that there were some things money couldn't buy, such as an extra 8 inches of sofa. The next morning, Alina woke early for work and called back over her shoulder that the kitchen faucet was leaking, and she would call a plumber over the weekend. William, who had just approved a $400 million deal over the phone from the bathroom, decided that a faucet was not a worthy opponent. 40 minutes later, when Alina returned because she had forgotten her bus pass, she opened the door and found the man from the snowstorm standing in the middle of a spreading pool of water, his hair soaked through, a wrench held backward in one hand, while the faucet shot a stream straight toward the ceiling like the fountain in Millennium Park. "Did you shut off the main valve?" "The what?" She waded through the water, crouched beneath the sink, turned one knob, and the stream stopped instantly. In the silence that followed, there was only the sound of water dripping from the ceiling onto his head, and Alina tried with all her strength not to laugh, but failed completely. "You really work security for a rich man?" "Security guards don't need to know how to fix plumbing. They don't need to hold a wrench backward either." That evening, it was the circuit breaker's turn. The old apartment had always had unreliable wiring, and when William plugged in the electric kettle beside the rice cooker, the entire 3rd floor plunged into darkness with a dry click. From the hallway came the loud cursing of an elderly neighbor, while inside the room, the flashlight from a phone illuminated 2 faces, and Mina released an exaggerated sigh. "That's my son. Handsome enough, but he couldn't tell a fuse from a piece of chewing gum." Yet beneath all his awkwardness, Alina began to notice something else. This man observed everything. He remembered that she drank ginger tea at night. He remembered that the 9th stair was loose and placed a hand behind her back every time she crossed it. He noticed the broken window lock and quietly replaced it one afternoon without telling anyone. And whenever his gaze moved across the room, it didn't look like the gaze of a guest. It looked like the gaze of a man mapping every possible entrance. 3 days later, Alina made her decision. She waited until Menna was asleep, brewed 2 cups of tea, placed one in front of William as he sat at the table reading something on his phone, then lowered herself into the chair across from him, her back straight, her fingers interlaced. "Ray, there's something you need to know." He set the phone down. "I'm pregnant. 3 months, the baby is yours, from that night. You're the only man." She spoke in a calm, even voice as though she were reading the weather. There were no tears, no trembling, and her eyes remained fixed on his. "I'm not telling you because I want anything from you. I'm telling you because you have the right to know. That's all." Inside William's chest, a machine that had operated with perfect precision for 16 years suddenly missed half a beat. He had sat through hundreds of negotiations and listened to thousands of people speak, and he knew what came next. There was always a price. Child support, an apartment, a measurable cost for silence. Everyone had a price. His mother had taught him that. Life had taught him that. His father's death had taught him that. He leaned back in his chair, and his voice returned to the temperature of a boardroom. "All right, what do you want?" Alina looked at him for 1 second, then instead of answering, she reached into her pocket, removed a sheet of paper folded into quarters, and slid it across the table. He opened it. It was handwritten in careful, evenly slanted letters with a clear heading at the top. "Declaration of Commitment. I, Alina Monroe, promise to raise my child myself using my own income. I won't request financial support. I won't request the father's name on the birth certificate if he doesn't want it there. I won't request any financial or legal obligation from the child's father, now or at any time in the future. He may see the child whenever he wishes, or never at all. That choice belongs to him, and I will respect it. Signed, Alina Monroe." Beneath it was a smaller postscript. The stack of money you left that night is still untouched inside the envelope. Whenever you want it back, it's in the second drawer." William read the page 3 times. The man who could assign a price to anything within 1,000 miles of Chicago sat motionless before a sheet of ordinary writing paper and couldn't find a single number on it. All his life, people had handed him bills, demands, and ultimatums. No one had ever handed him a piece of paper whose entire meaning was that nothing was needed. "Why?" he finally asked, his voice rougher than he intended. "Why did you have to write this?" "Because I don't know who you are, but I know who I am." She lifted her cup and blew gently across the tea. "My mother was once turned into a burden by a man she had to run from. My child will never be anyone's burden. This baby is mine." End of story. She stood, washed her cup, straightened the sheets on Mena's bed, then wished him good night, as though they had merely discussed the electric bill. Leaving William alone at the table with the paper in his hand, reading it again and again beneath the yellow light like a language he had never learned. Close to 2 o'clock in the morning, he was still awake. His gaze settled on top of the refrigerator, where a bottle of the cheapest prenatal vitamins from the drugstore sat beside a budget notebook filled with figures, so small they were painful to see, and some invisible hand tightened around something inside his chest, something he had believed frozen solid for 16 years. He stepped into the hallway, closed the door behind him, and raised the phone to his ear. On the other end, Polly answered before the first ring had finished. "Boss? Starting tomorrow, no company vehicle is to come within 6 blocks of this neighborhood. Anyone who needs to see me uses an ordinary car, parks far away, and walks in. Understood, boss." Polly hesitated for half a second. "Boss, how's the sofa?" William looked through the narrow opening of the door into the small, dark room where 2 women slept, one carrying his secret and the other carrying his own flesh and blood, while the declaration remained in the breast pocket of his shirt like a piece of burning paper. "Polly, yes, boss? Ask me that again, and you'll become a real security guard." He ended the call to the sound of smothered laughter on the other end, went back inside, lay down on the sofa that was 8 inches too short, and for the first time in 16 years, William Barone fell asleep without needing a single pill. Trouble began on a crowded Friday afternoon, when the guest at table 7, a Wall Street broker, wearing a blue dial Patek Philippe worth as much as an entire house, removed the watch and placed it beside his plate before washing his hands, then 10 minutes later began shouting that it had disappeared. Gordon Ames immediately turned the rear lobby into an interrogation room. Every employee on the afternoon shift was lined up along the locker room corridor, and Whitney Hale stood at the front with an expression of concern she had clearly rehearsed, becoming the first to speak in a voice as sweet as artificial sugar. "I don't want to suspect anyone, Gordon, but earlier I saw someone go into the locker area during the shift, and according to the rules, no one is supposed to be back there at that hour, right?" "Who?" "I don't dare say." "All right, it was Alina." Every pair of eyes turned toward the end of the line. Alina stood straight, her hands still carrying the scent of glass cleaner. "I went to get nausea medicine from my coat pocket. 3 minutes. Dana saw me leave and come back." Dana Whitfield nodded rapidly, but Gordon had already waved her aside. "Open her locker." When the metal door of locker number 19 swung open, the entire corridor heard 20 people draw breath at once, because resting on top of Alina's worn cloth bag, the blue dial Patek glittered beneath the fluorescent lights like a verdict. "No," Alina felt the blood drain from her face. "It wasn't me. I swear, someone put it there. Someone?" Gordon sneered, holding the watch up for the entire line to see like a prosecutor displaying evidence. "Every thief says that. I knew it from the start. Your kind, dirt poor, drowning in debt, and now pregnant without a husband. You needed money, so you decided to take your chances, didn't you? There's no place at the Meridian for trash like you. I'm calling the police right now. Once they put you in jail, you won't have anywhere left to hide." Every word struck like a slap before 20 pairs of eyes. Some people looked away. Others discreetly raised their phones to record. Whitney stood with her arms folded, lips pressed together to conceal a smile, while Alina clenched both hands until her knuckles turned white and managed only one sentence without letting her voice break. "I want to make a phone call. Even the police have to give me that right." In the shadowed corner beside the ice machine, she raised the phone to her ear, and when the familiar deep voice answered after the first ring, she could speak only in a whisper. "Ray, I'm sorry to bother you while you're working. Someone framed me for stealing a customer's watch. They're about to call the police. I didn't take it. I just needed to tell someone that I didn't take it. The other end remained silent for exactly 2 seconds before that voice returned, strangely calm. I believe you. Stay exactly where you are. Don't sign anything, and don't let anyone search your bag again. 30 minutes. She didn't know that on the other side of the city, the man who had just spoken those words had risen abruptly from a conference table, nor did she know that the next call made from his phone caused the director of operations for the parent company's restaurant chain to abandon his lunch. Exactly 28 minutes later, as Gordon eagerly began dialing the local police precinct, the restaurant's desk phone rang first. He answered it, and everyone in the corridor watched his flushed red face slowly turn the color of wet cement. Yes, sir, but the camera in that corner has been broken for some time. No, what I mean is, yes, we'll retrieve the footage immediately. It turned out that the small camera above the locker corridor, the one Gordon had assumed had been broken since the previous year and had been too lazy to repair, had quietly been replaced by the parent company during winter maintenance. When the footage was displayed directly on the office monitor before the entire afternoon staff at the corporation's specific demand, everyone in the room clearly saw Whitney Hale slip into the locker area at 2:17 in the afternoon, one sleeve of her coat bulging around a small object. She opened locker number 19, using the shift supervisor's master key, placed something inside, then walked out while smiling and touching up her lipstick. The silence that followed was so thick they could hear water dripping from the ice machine. Gordon, Whitney stammered. I can explain, but the desk phone rang a second time, and this time Gordon answered every sentence with no more than 4 obedient words, sweat spreading across the back of his shirt before he placed the receiver down and announced in the voice of a man who had just looked into an abyss that, by direct order of the corporate operations board, Whitney Hale was being removed from the Meridian effective immediately pending disciplinary action. The Patek Philippe would be returned to its owner with an apology and a complimentary dinner, while Alina Monroe, whose 3-year service record contained not a single violation, was being appointed shift supervisor in Whitney's place, effective with the following morning's shift. When Gordon finished reading, he looked at Alina as though she were an unexploded mine, and his voice suddenly became polite in a way no one had ever heard before. Miss Monroe, if you need to leave early today, please feel free. Dana threw her arms around Alina behind the kitchen. Several line cooks secretly gave her a thumbs up, and Alina stood amid the congratulations with one question spinning endlessly through her mind. How could a single phone call to a security guard move heaven and earth like that? That evening, William waited for her beneath the street lamp across from the employee entrance, his hands tucked into the pockets of his wool coat, and when she came outside, he asked only whether she had eaten, as though he knew nothing about the earthquake that had shaken her afternoon. She studied him for a long moment, then decided to leave the question until tomorrow, because there were days when a person had enough strength only for gratitude, not suspicion. Neither of them saw the phone camera, aimed through the partly lowered window of a car parked across the street, taking more than a dozen photographs of the tall man, draping his coat over the new shift supervisor's shoulders. Inside the vehicle, Whitney Hale, her eyes still swollen from crying and hatred, scrolled through the images and selected the clearest one of his face. She remembered that Francesca Salerno, a high society VIP who used to frequent the Meridian, had once secretly offered a fortune to anyone who could provide information on the Barone family. Whitney typed a message. You said you paid generously for information about the men from that family. Look closely at this man. I swear I've seen his face in the financial press. Her finger pressed send, and on the screen, the recipient's name glowed in the darkness of the car. Francesca Salerno. Alina discovered the truth on the 4th night after becoming shift supervisor, when she came home late and noticed a small plate covered with a paper napkin resting on the apartment windowsill. Beneath it lay half a serving of stew, and a slice of bread arranged neatly beside it, with warmth still lingering in the porcelain. She assumed Mena had saved the food for her and carried it inside, but Mena, who had been sitting beside the bed, suddenly rose in alarm and snatched the plate from her hands, her old fingers trembling with confusion. Don't. Leave that there for me. Alina stopped, and in her memory, small details began lining themselves up. Every night, no matter what they cooked, Mena wrapped one portion and placed it on the windowsill. By morning, the food would still be untouched, and the old woman would quietly clear it away without a word. Alina had thought it was simply the habit of someone who had once known hunger, saving something in case it was needed later. But the panic in Mina's eyes that night wasn't the look of someone afraid of losing food. It was the look of someone whose wound had been touched. "Mina," she asked very softly, "who do you leave that food for?" The room became so quiet that they could hear the heater ticking. Mina stood there for a long time, the plate trembling in her hands, then slowly lowered herself onto the edge of the bed and rested it in her lap, as though placing something sacred there. When she finally spoke, her voice was no longer the voice of the sharp old woman who ordered around the two children living in this apartment. It had become thin and distant, like an echo returning from a winter long ago. "It's for my eldest son. He used to get hungry at night. He'd been that way since he was little. Around midnight, he would always sneak down to the kitchen, and if I didn't leave food ready for him, he'd eat something cold and end up with a stomachache." She smiled, and the smile made Alina want to cry before she even understood why. His name was Tonio. He was the most handsome in the family, the brightest in the family, and the most stubborn. Back then, our family was involved in work he hated. He hated it down to the bone. When he was 19, he stood up in the middle of dinner, pointed at his father, and said he would rather starve than eat another meal paid for by that life. Then he picked up a cloth bag and walked out the door without looking back. I followed him all the way to the end of the street. He only told me to take care of myself, and then he left. The paper napkin covering the plate trembled with her hands. People told me to let him taste the hardships of the world, and that he would eventually come home. So I waited. 1 year. 3 years. I heard he was living on the south side and working as a laborer. Then I heard he had become involved with drugs. I packed a bag and went looking for him, but he hid from me. He sent home only one message: "Don't look for me. I don't want the shadow of our family falling over me anymore." I carried that child beneath my heart for 9 months and 10 days. I knew every scar on his knees, yet during the final 6 years of his life, I wasn't allowed to see his face even once. She stopped and swallowed, and Alina didn't dare breathe too loudly. Then one morning in March, on a day as cold as the week you found me, the police came to my door with a photograph and asked whether I recognized the person in it. My Tonio was lying on the sidewalk on West Randolph, exactly 3 steps from the place where you handed me that first container of food. They told me he had been lying there for 3 days, child. 3 days. Thousands of people walked past him. Someone thought he was only a pile of torn blankets. Someone stepped around him so they wouldn't dirty their shoes. By the time anyone finally bent down to look, my son was already cold. He died less than 70 feet from a bakery. He starved and froze to death in the middle of this city. Tears had begun falling onto the backs of Alina's hands without her realizing it, but Mena didn't cry. She had crossed beyond tears a long time ago. She only reached slowly inside her coat and removed the plastic-wrapped photograph, with worn corners that she had held against her chest throughout the days she sat on the sidewalk. With the tenderness of someone removing a bandage from a wound, she peeled away each strip of tape and placed an old yellowing photograph in Alina's hands. A dark-haired young man was grinning on a beach, one arm around the shoulders of a boy of about 10 with solemn dark eyes. Behind them stood a beautiful, radiant young woman whom Alina immediately recognized as Mina 30 years earlier. Ever since he died, when that week comes each year, I can't bear that enormous house anymore. I put on the old coat he left behind and go sit on that exact stretch of sidewalk during the same days he lay there, because I need to see whether the world that stepped over my son has changed after 6 years. You already know the answer. 6 years, tens of thousands of pairs of shoes. Only one girl, dizzy with hunger herself, crossed the street, knelt on wet concrete, handed me the only meal she had that day, and told me to sit still because I looked terribly weak. Mina lifted her eyes to Alina, and for the first time, Alina saw moisture gathering in those ash-gray eyes. I wasn't hungry for food that day, child. I was hungry for something else. I had been starving for 6 years, and you were the first person who fed me. Alina couldn't speak anymore. She dropped to her knees before the old woman, wrapped her arms around that frail body, pressed her face against Mena's shoulder, and wept as she hadn't allowed herself to weep since the day her mother died. Through her tears, she heard herself whisper, "My mother died in a charity ward. During her final days, no one could even be bothered to look at her. "I understand, Mama Mina, I understand." The words Mama Mina slipped from her as naturally as breath, and the old woman's arms froze for half a second before tightening around her. A mother who had lost her child held a child who had lost her mother, while the warm plate of food rested between them like a small lamp. Neither of them knew that William Barone had been standing motionless in the hallway, beyond the partly closed door for the past 10 minutes, the key still hanging from one finger. He had come home early intending to share good news about a contract, and he had heard everything, every word of the story his mother had never told him in that way, about the older brother he had worshipped at 10 and resented at 20, about the 3 days, the 3 steps, and the 6 years his mother had quietly spent, sitting on a frozen sidewalk, while his entire security operation had known only enough to report that the old lady had disappeared again. Boss, the man who made all of Chicago bow, stood leaning against the wall of the dark hallway, his face tilted toward the ceiling, and the hot trails running down both temples were something he hadn't permitted himself to feel since the morning he stood before a coffin covered in white flowers 6 years earlier. He remained there for a long time without entering, because some rooms are so sacred that men must remain outside. Then he wiped his face with his palm, descended 3 flights of stairs, stepped onto the cold sidewalk, and raised his phone to his ear. When Polly answered, William's voice had already become smooth as steel again, though only Polly, after 15 years, could hear the hairline fracture beneath it. "Investigate something for me. Over the past 6 years at the West Randolph corner, find every person who chased away, sprayed water on, or threw things at the homeless people sheltering there. Names, positions, places of employment. Every single one of them." "Understood, boss. Anything else?" William looked up toward the 3rd-floor window, where the warm yellow light still glowed, and 2 shadows remained wrapped around each other behind the thin curtain. "Yes. Find me a flower shop that's still open, white flowers. The kind people bring to a cemetery." Aunt Darlene's message arrived on Sunday afternoon, unusually sweet in tone. "Come over for dinner tonight. It's been a long time since the family sat down together. I'm making the roast chicken you loved when you were little." Alina read it 3 times, because in the 7 years since her mother's death, Aunt Darlene had never invited her to a meal without attaching a bill to it. But the word family was still something the orphaned child inside her had never learned how to refuse. So at 7 o'clock that evening, she stood outside a 2-story house in Cicero, with a homemade apple pie in her hands. The door opened, and she immediately understood that she had walked into a trap. In the living room, besides Aunt Darlene with her carefully applied makeup, there was a woman wearing enough gold to cover her entire neck, seated beside a man in his 30s whose shirt strained tightly across his body, his hair slicked with shining gel, his cologne reaching all the way to the doorway. Brett Kowalski, son of the owner of Kowalski & Son Pawn Shop on Cermak Street, the business holding 2/3 of her debt. "Alina, come in." Darlene pulled her toward a chair as though dragging merchandise onto a sales counter. "You remember Mrs. Kowalski, don't you? And this is Brett. He's doing wonderfully in business. He just opened his 3rd location." Dinner passed beneath such shameless praise that it became embarrassing. Brett spoke about his new car in the voice of a man reading a price list, while his eyes traveled over Alina's body, as though appraising an item someone had left in pawn. When dessert arrived, Darlene set down her knife and fork, cleared her throat, pulled a stack of typed papers from the buffet drawer, and pushed them across the table. "I'll speak plainly. Mrs. Kowalski has a kind heart. She feels sorry for your situation, so she and I discussed an arrangement. You marry Brett with all the proper paperwork, and his family will erase the entire $60,000 of your mother's hospital debt. Erase it all. Do you understand? No more debt, a house of your own, a completely different life." Alina stared at the papers. The words prenuptial agreement struck her eyes, and a ringing filled her ears. "You invited me here to sell me into marriage?" "Watch your mouth," Mrs. Kowalski frowned, twisting the ring on her little finger. "Darlene told me you weren't married, but apparently you're already carrying a baby. Even so, our family is generous. We'll accept the bastard too, but let me make one thing clear. Under these circumstances, you have no right to make demands. A girl like you should thank 7 generations of ancestors that my Brett is willing to marry you. Do you understand?" "Exactly," Darlene said, leaning forward, her voice hissing through clenched teeth. Do you think you're still worth something? Sign it. Or I'll sell that debt to a collection agency, and when they come after you, don't blame me. And those boxes of your mother's things in my garage, I'm running out of space for them too." The room became utterly silent. Alina looked down at the apple pie she had brought, still unopened, because no one had even bothered to touch it, and in that moment she heard her mother's voice from very far away, the voice of a woman who had spent her entire life carrying her younger sister, only to die with no one willing to look at her. Then Alina stood, slowly, and pushed the papers back toward the center of the table. "My mother paid for both of your children to attend school. My mother paid your mortgage for 3 years after your husband left. My mother never refused you a single thing in her life, and you let her die carrying a debt that one insurance signature from you could have cut in half. I love my mother more than anything in this world, but I'm not my mother. You won't use me the way you used her. And as for my child," she said, placing one hand over her stomach, "this baby would rather grow up in a rented room with a mother who holds her head high than in a mansion with a mother who was sold." She picked up her coat and turned toward the door, but Brett jumped to his feet and blocked her path. His breath carried the heavy smell of wine, and a hand weighted with a gold ring seized her wrist and squeezed. "Now, hold on. It's not that easy. People are trying to speak to you respectfully, and take your hand off her." The voice from the doorway wasn't loud, but the whole room turned cold, as though someone had opened a freezer. Alina turned and saw William standing there, the chill of the night still clinging to his black wool coat. No one had heard him come in. "Who the hell are you?" Brett lifted his chin, though his grip loosened instinctively. William stepped forward, calmly removed Brett's fingers from Alina's wrist as though peeling away something filthy, then drew her behind him. He leaned close to Brett's ear, and what he said was quiet enough for only one man to hear, his voice even and soft, as though reading from a directory. "Kowalski and Son. 3 locations. Your pawnshop license renewal has been overdue since November. 17 compound interest loan agreements. Convert to more than 300% annually. Triple the Illinois state interest ceiling. And an employee of the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation accepted gifts from your father 3 times. Right, federal investigators would be particularly interested in that part. Now sit down, and make sure the name Kowalski never appears anywhere near her again." Brett's face whitened with every sentence, like paper meeting bleach. He stumbled backward 2 steps, struck the chair, and collapsed into it. William turned, took Alina's hand, and gave Darlene, who was staring with her mouth open, a nod carrying all the warmth of 34 degrees Fahrenheit. "Thank you for dinner." On Tuesday morning, Kowalski and Son displayed a sign announcing that the business was temporarily closed for inspection. By Thursday afternoon, Alina received a call from a law office informing her that the entire $60,000 debt had been purchased by an anonymous trust under new terms. 0% interest, payments based entirely on her ability to pay, no deadline, along with one binding condition imposed on the seller, which the attorney read word for word. Every personal possession belonging to the late Mrs. Monroe, and currently held by a third party, must be returned in its original condition within 48 hours. On Friday afternoon, a small moving truck stopped outside the building, and 4 cardboard boxes sealed with yellowed tape were unloaded onto the sidewalk. Alina knelt there among the passing crowds and opened the first one. Her fingers touched the unfinished wool scarf her mother had been knitting, the photograph album covered in floral fabric, and an empty perfume bottle, still carrying the faint trace of a fragrance that had vanished long ago. She gathered the entire box against her chest and sobbed in the middle of the street like a child who had found her mother again. William stood 3 steps away with his hands in his pockets, watching her with an expression that would have told her everything if she had looked up at that moment. But that evening, after she had calmed down, she sat beside him on the apartment stairs and asked the question that could no longer remain unspoken. "Ray, what anonymous trust buys the debt of a waitress and charges no interest? Who would do something like that? And how did you know all those things about the licenses and the investigators when you spoke to Brett?" William looked down at his hands for exactly 1 second, and the lie slipped out smoothly as though it had been carefully oiled. "My boss knows a lot of people. I told him what happened to you, and he felt sorry for you, so he made one phone call. To a man like him, $60,000 is pocket change. Don't think too much about it. Alina watched him for a long time beneath the weak yellow light of the stairwell, and in her eyes, a tiny speck of suspicion spun slowly, searching for somewhere to settle. Then she looked down at the 4 boxes of memories arranged neatly in the hallway, thought of the man who had placed himself between her and that entire room, and consciously chose to set that speck aside. "Then thank your boss for me," she said softly. Suddenly she turned and looked directly into his eyes, and her voice changed into a tone he had never heard from her before, clear and sharp as glass. "Ray, I'm going to tell you something once, and only once, so listen carefully. My father lied to my mother for 11 years. Even when she closed her eyes for the last time, she still believed one of his promises. I stood beside her bed and watched it happen. So there are 2 kinds of people I hate more than anyone in this world. Those who bully the weak, and those who lie to someone who trusts them. You can be poor. You can be clumsy. You can spend the rest of your life unable to repair a faucet. I don't care. But if you deceive me, even once, I swear I'll take my child and disappear from your life forever without a single word of goodbye. Do you understand what I'm saying?" The stairwell light flickered once, then steadied. William Barone, the man carrying in his coat pocket the phone that had made the 3 calls responsible for every miracle of that week, the man living in her home under a name that wasn't his own, looked into the clear eyes waiting before him and heard his own voice answer, strangely hoarse. "I understand." At 6 o'clock the following morning, while Alina was still asleep, William was already standing inside the private elevator of the glass tower beside the Chicago River, and when the steel doors opened on the 39th floor, the sleepy, awkward man from the 430-square-foot room no longer existed. Only William Barone remained, striding down the marble corridor in a charcoal gray suit, while 12 powerful men rose sharply around the long table, as though someone had suddenly pulled all the air from the room. "Sit." He didn't need to raise his voice. "Report." The port manager opened a file with fingers that weren't entirely steady. 3 longtime loading contractors at the southern docks had abruptly canceled their agreements within the same week. 2 bars in the chain had been subjected to repeated fire inspections following anonymous complaints, and a licensing official they had known for 20 years had suddenly stopped answering his phone. Each piece alone looked like bad luck, but together they formed a hand quietly tightening around the throat of the Barone Empire, and that hand had an owner, Lev Volkov. Polly placed a long-distance photograph on the table. It showed a man in his 50s with closely cropped silver hair, sitting in a greenhouse drinking tea like a retired professor. He moved here from Brighton Beach 18 months ago. He moves slowly and he keeps everything clean. He buys our people for 3 times their price and purchases silence with something even more expensive. He doesn't want a war, boss. He wants us to die by inches. William studied the photograph for a long time, while every man around the table held his breath and waited for an order to retaliate. But he only said, "Strengthen what we already have. Raise the dock workers' pay by 15% and give them long-term contracts. Have the attorneys review every license this week. He wants us frightened enough to break the law first. We won't give him that gift." He stood, fastened the button of his suit jacket, then paused at the door. "And Polly, the matter I gave you last night, the West Randolph list, I want it on my desk before Friday." No one in that room dared ask why their boss, in the middle of a siege, was concerning himself with the people who had once sprayed water on homeless men and women at a street corner. That same afternoon, in the rooftop tier room of an old hotel, Lev Volkov poured tea for his female guest, with the graceful movements of a man who had been properly educated, and Francesca Salerno, 32 years old, and flawless from the heels of her shoes to the lines around her eyes, accepted the cup with a smile that had once melted half of East Coast society. "Miss Salerno, does your father know you're having tea with me?" "My father is old, Mr. Volkov. He believes the Salerno name can survive forever on the glow of its past. I believe in choosing the right side before the game is over. And you believe my side will win? I believe you're losing." She took a sip of tea, perfectly calm as the cold gray eyes across the table narrowed. "You've been squeezing his ports, his licenses, and his people for a year and a half, and he hasn't even bothered to strike back. Do you know why? Because William Barone has nothing to lose except his work. No wife, no child, no passion, no vice. A man who loves nothing has no door through which you can enter, sir. I was once engaged to him. I know that fortress better than anyone, so you came to tell me this is hopeless. I came to sell you the door. Francesca placed her phone on the mahogany table and turned the screen toward Volkov. Displayed there were photographs taken hastily through the narrow opening of a car window by a bitter young woman named Whitney. A tall man in a wool coat stood beneath a street lamp outside a restaurant's employee entrance. Draping his coat over the shoulders of a figure the streetlight revealed only as a blurred shape. But look carefully at the line of his jaw. Look at the way he stands to shield the person beside him. I sat across from this man through 30 family dinners, Mr. Volkov. That is William Barone. Without bodyguards, without a convoy, standing beneath a street lamp in a working-class neighborhood on the southwest side, like a husband waiting to collect his wife. A man like him doesn't simply appear in a place like that. He's hiding something in that neighborhood, and I promise you, whatever it is means more to him than every dock he owns. Meanwhile, nearly 7 miles away, the secret he was hiding had taken the form of a 2-tier lunch container wrapped in a checkered cloth. Alina pressed it into William's hands as he prepared to leave, telling him the lower compartment held chicken stew that had to be eaten while it was still warm, while the upper one contained an experimental apple pastry he wasn't allowed to criticize. He stood frozen in the hallway, staring at the checkered bundle as though it were an unfamiliar object that had fallen from another planet. What's wrong? Is it too heavy? No, it's just. The man who had commanded 12 men with 4 sentences suddenly struggled to find the words. No one has ever packed food for me before. Not once, Alina looked at him, and something in her chest softened in a dangerously tender way. Then you'd better get used to it. In this home, no one has to eat takeout alone. She rose onto her toes and straightened his collar, a small gesture as natural as breathing, and William Barone walked down 3 flights of stairs in the old apartment building, carrying a lunch container wrapped in checkered cloth, passing 2 plainclothes bodyguards pretending to repair a bicycle across the street. Both men immediately bent their heads very low to hide the expressions on their faces. Late that afternoon, in the rooftop greenhouse, Lev Volkov was still seated before the enlarged photographs, arranged beside one another, like a card game only partly revealed. He didn't trust beautiful women, and he didn't trust those who betrayed their own families to sell information. But he trusted one truth he had tested over 30 years. Every fortress fell from within, and the inner gate of any man always took the shape of something he loved. Volkov's ringed finger tapped slowly against the photograph of the man beneath the street lamp. 3 measured beats like the striking of a clock. Then he raised his eyes toward the assistant waiting in the shadows beneath the bougainvillea and spoke in the gentle voice of someone placing an order. He's hiding something on the southwest side. Find out what it is. The invitation was delivered to Alina on a Monday morning, inside a thick cream-colored envelope, embossed with 2 interlocking letters, B, and she had to read it 3 times before she could believe what it said. The Barone Charitable Foundation respectfully invites Miss Alina Monroe, guest of honor and representative of Chicago's outstanding service industry employees, to attend the annual gala at the Meridian on Saturday evening. The entire restaurant was buzzing because in the 12-year history of the most prestigious gala in the city's social world, no server had ever been invited to enter through the main doors as a guest. When Gordon called corporate headquarters with trembling hands to verify it, the answer was brief enough to send a chill down his spine. The decision came from the owner's office. There would be no explanation and no questions. Whitney Hale, who had recently been transferred to a second-tier location, but still heard the news through employee group chats, smashed a coffee mug in the break room. Alina, meanwhile, only asked William that evening why they had chosen her, and he, the man who had arranged everything with 3 sentences over the phone, calmly ladled more soup into her bowl. Maybe they want at least one person in the ballroom this year who knows how to pour wine correctly. Go. You deserve it. But no one was more excited than Mina. She made Alina try on the only midnight blue evening dress she owned, one she had bought during a clearance sale 2 years earlier, then altered the waist herself to fit the gentle curve that had begun to form around Alina's stomach. She brushed Alina's hair as though brushing her own daughter's, and it wasn't until Saturday evening, when Alina was fully dressed, that Mina slowly reached into the bottom of her cloth bag and drew out a small wooden box wrapped in a handkerchief. Put this on. Inside, resting on faded velvet, was a cream-colored strand of pearls with an intricately carved white gold clasp shaped like 2 irises. Alina knew nothing about jewelry, yet even she could feel its unusual weight in her palm. Mamma Mina. This looks real. I can't wear it, real? What nonsense. It came from a thrift store on Milwaukee Street. It was cheap, only a few dollars. Mina waved dismissively, but her fingers moved with inexplicable slowness and tenderness as she fastened the pearls around Alina's neck. In the mirror, Alina caught a glimpse of something shimmering in those ash-gray eyes before Mena turned away quickly, her voice becoming brusque again. There, you look beautiful. Go before you're late. And remember, no matter what anyone says, keep your head high. You don't owe a single person in that room a penny. That night, the Meridian was no longer the place where Alina worked. It had become a palace of light, with a red carpet stretching from the curb, crystal chandeliers descending from a ceiling nearly 20 feet high, and a procession of people entering through the doors whose faces she had seen on magazine covers, diamonds flashing against necks pulled smooth by surgery. She walked among them in her hand-altered blue dress and Mamma Mina's pearls, the gold invitation trembling lightly in her hand. When the attendant bowed with the full ceremony reserved for guests of honor, several diamond-covered necks turned to look. The first half-hour passed peacefully. Dana secretly winked at her from the service area. A journalist even interviewed her about her profession, and Alina began to believe the evening might truly be beautiful, until a woman's voice sounded behind her, sweet and cold as chilled champagne. "Excuse me, have we met?" Alina turned and saw a woman whose beauty was sharp enough to cut, dressed in a deep wine-red gown and standing among a circle of elegant ladies. Her eyes weren't looking at Alina's face. They were fixed on her neck. "I don't believe so. I'm Alina Monroe, a guest of the Foundation, a guest." The woman repeated the word as though tasting something unfamiliar, then slowly circled Alina like someone inspecting an object, her perfectly lined eyes narrowing with every step. "That necklace. Where did you get it?" "My mother gave it to me." "Your mother?" Francesca Salerno released a bright, ringing laugh that made half the ballroom turn their heads, and when she spoke again, her volume had been carefully measured to reach every corner of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, did anyone here attend the Barone family's 30th wedding anniversary celebration? Does anyone remember the South Sea pearl necklace with the custom iris clasp made in Milan, the family heirloom worn by the matriarch throughout the entire evening? Because I remember it very clearly. I was seated at table number 1, and now it's hanging around the neck of a waitress. Whispers spread like spilled oil. Glasses stopped halfway to lips. Someone gasped, "My God," and Alina felt 200 pairs of eyes fall upon her at once like a storm of ice. "You're mistaken," she said, keeping her voice as steady as she could. "This was a gift from my mother." "Who is your mother that she could possibly own a 6-figure piece of jewelry, waitress?" A woman wearing gold-rimmed glasses cut in, and from somewhere behind the crowd, Gordon Ames pushed his way forward, sensing an opportunity to redeem himself in the eyes of the owners, his voice booming with righteous outrage. "I knew it. She works for me. She was previously suspected of stealing a customer's watch. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the restaurant, I apologize. We'll deal with this immediately. Miss Monroe, remove that necklace at once and come with me. I won't take it off." Alina stepped backward, one hand rising to the pearls. Her heart was racing, but her spine remained straight, and she heard her own voice ring clearly through the forest of raised phones surrounding her, flashes bursting like predatory fireflies. "My mother gave me this necklace tonight before I left home. I don't know how any of you have become confused, but I haven't stolen anything from anyone, and I won't remove my mother's gift in front of any of you. Here we go." "Keep recording, everyone," someone giggled. "The waitress stole the Barone family heirloom, and still has the nerve to argue." Francesca folded her arms and tilted her head toward 2 security officers in black suits who were moving through the crowd at Gordon's signal. "Then perhaps security can help refresh your memory. Don't ruin the evening for decent people, young lady." The crowd parted into the shape of an arena. The 2 dark figures closed in, and the first guard's white-gloved hand reached forward until it was only 8 inches from Alina's shoulder. The white-gloved hand never reached Alina's shoulder, because at that exact moment, from the top of the grand double staircase in the main ballroom, a voice descended. It didn't shout and it didn't snarl. It was simply placed into the room with the weight of a slab of granite falling onto still water. "Who gave any of you permission to touch my daughter?" Every head in the ballroom turned at once, and the entire room fell silent in the same breath. At the highest step, beneath a crystal chandelier hanging nearly 20 feet overhead, stood a silver-haired woman in a flawlessly tailored black evening gown, her back straight as a ruler, a slender diamond bracelet at her wrist, and two men in dark suits positioned just behind her shoulders in a formation anyone in that world could understand. The highest level of personal protection. She descended one step at a time, slowly, without taking anyone's arm, and Chicago's elite parted automatically before her, like water before the bow of a ship. Champagne glasses stopped halfway to painted lips. One gentleman dropped an unlit cigar, and in the corner of the ballroom, Gordon Ames stood frozen with his mouth still open around an unfinished order. Alina was the only person in the room who didn't understand what was happening, because the grand woman holding 200 people breathless had the face of the woman who had scolded her that very morning for pouring soda into the cup she used for medicine, and the same ash-gray eyes as the elderly woman who forced her to drink a second glass of milk every night. "Mama? Mena?" she whispered. Mena stopped before the two security officers, and with nothing more than a look, both men retreated 3 steps, as though pushed backward by the wind. Then she turned toward the crowd, speaking no louder than someone conversing over afternoon tea. Yet, in that silence, every syllable landed with perfect clarity. "This necklace belongs to me. I gave it to the girl tonight, and I fastened it around her neck with my own hands. Anyone here who still has questions about where it came from may come and ask me directly. As for those of you who raised your phones to record my daughter, I suggest you delete the footage, because my attorneys count very quickly." She took Alina's hand, and her gaze passed over Francesca Salerno for exactly 1 second. Only 1 second, but within it, the beauty in the red gown turned pale as though she had touched ice, and stepped half a pace backward, the bracelet at her wrist trembling faintly. Some faces could be forgotten, but some eyes never could, and Francesca had just realized that she had made the greatest mistake of her life. She hadn't recognized the woman until Mina stood only 3 steps away. "Enjoy the evening, everyone," Mina said to the ballroom, then linked her arm through Alina's and walked directly toward the side corridor, while the 2 bodyguards closed formation behind them. In their wake, the ballroom erupted into whispers, and Gordon Ames wiped sweat from his face with a guest's dinner napkin. In the empty corridor, Alina stood staring at Mena, 1,000 questions crowding her throat. "Mama Mena, who are you really? The bodyguards, the diamonds, that entire ballroom was afraid of you, and this necklace really is." "Hush!" Mena reached up and smoothed a loose strand of hair at Alina's temple, calm as though they were standing in the kitchen at home. "I worked as a housekeeper for the Barone family for decades, child. Head housekeeper. I helped raise every person in that house, so they respect me. They lend me bodyguards, and they give me old things the lady of the house no longer wears. The necklace was given to me years ago. I only said it came from a thrift store because I knew you would feel embarrassed wearing it otherwise. Now stop asking questions. Tonight belongs to you. Don't let those painted crows steal it away." The explanation was smooth and convincing in 9 parts out of 10, and Alina, standing there with the pearls warm against her throat, and Mina's hand warm inside her own, chose to swallow the remaining part that stirred uneasily in her chest. The part whispering that no housekeeper in the world possessed a gaze powerful enough to make all of Chicago society part before her like the sea. The gala ended close to midnight. Mina left early in a private car with the bodyguards, while Alina stayed behind to help Dana clear the room, a habit she couldn't seem to break. Carrying a stack of tablecloths through the large kitchen, where most of the lights had been turned off, she found William leaning against a stainless steel counter, still wearing the charcoal gray suit she had never seen before, holding 2 glasses of water as though they were champagne. "What are you doing here? How did you get into the kitchen?" "Security guards have access cards." He handed her one of the glasses, and from the phone resting on the counter, an old jazz song began to rise softly, spreading through the air that still smelled of toasted bread and leftover lilies from the gala. "I heard tonight's guest of honor never got a single dance. I don't know how to dance, and look at me. My feet are swollen, my dress is wrinkled, and my hair has fallen apart, so what?" He set his glass down and extended one hand with the solemn dignity of a man inviting a queen, while the single yellow light still burning above them fell across his shoulders. "Out there, they wear beautiful things, Alina. You make beautiful things worth something. No one in that ballroom shone more brightly than you tonight. Believe me, I stood far enough away to see everything. She laughed, placed her hand in his, and they danced in the middle of the stainless steel kitchen, awkwardly and slowly, her bare feet moving over the cool tile, because her high heels had been kicked beneath the counter long ago. The scent of vanilla from the cooling ovens mingled with the warmth at his collar, while the saxophone crackled through the phone speaker. As the music slowed, he rested his chin lightly against her hair, and she could hear his heart beating beneath the suit, much faster than the rhythm of the song. In that moment, inside the kitchen of the restaurant that had watched her be humiliated twice, Alina Monroe felt completely protected by a poor security guard who couldn't repair a faucet. At that same hour, in a penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, Francesca Salerno sat before her dressing table with a glass of red wine shimmering in her hand. Across the stone surface, photographs had been arranged in 2 rows. The upper row held the blurred images Whitney had taken of the man beneath the street lamp, draping his coat over a shadowed figure. The lower row held the photographs Francesca had taken at the gala that evening, sharp and brightly lit, showing the young woman in the blue dress wearing the pearl necklace, her head held high while surrounded by the crowd. Francesca's red-painted finger moved back and forth between the 2 rows, matching the shoulders, the posture, the height of the blurred figure with the girl in the blue gown. Each piece slid into place as smoothly as a clasp closing, and the smile that formed slowly on Francesca's lips was beautiful and cold as a cut. She picked up her phone, dialed a number without a saved name, and when the person on the other end answered in familiar silence, Francesca turned her chair toward the window and looked down at the city glittering with 10 million lights, her voice lilting almost like a song. "Mr. Volkov, you can stop looking. I found Barone's heart. She wears a blue dress, she wears his mother's pearls, and she waits tables in his own restaurant. Her name is Alina Monroe." 3 days after the gala, at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, Chicago was shaken by a breaking news alert. Alina was working the evening shift and knew nothing. While on the north side of the city, the entire incident lasted only 11 seconds. A convoy of 3 black vehicles had stopped at a red light on the avenue when a small truck swerved across the road in front of them. A series of deafening explosions tore through the afternoon. The bulletproof glass of the middle vehicle cracked into a spiderweb, but didn't shatter. Tires screamed against the pavement, and the convoy escaped the scene according to a plan they had rehearsed 100 times, leaving behind a chaotic intersection filled with blaring horns, spent shell casings scattered across the asphalt, and not a single civilian injured. The man riding in the middle vehicle stepped out in the underground garage of the glass tower 10 minutes later, brushing fragments of safety glass from the shoulders of his suit without the slightest change in his expression. Only his clenched jaw betrayed anything when Polly reported that the truck had been rented with false documents and that every trail had been wiped clean in the familiar Russian style. But Lev Volkov, no matter how carefully he had calculated, had made one mistake he hadn't yet recognized. Opening fire in broad daylight in downtown Chicago hadn't merely alerted the city police, it had awakened a far larger beast. That very evening, during the nightly news, a spokesperson for the FBI's Chicago field office appeared before a forest of microphones and briefly announced that the Bureau had formally opened a large-scale investigation into criminal organizations operating throughout the city, with the full range of investigative measures authorized by a federal court, including financial surveillance and electronic monitoring of communications involving anyone connected to the parties concerned. It was a dry official statement that drifted across the screen like thousands of others, something no one bothered to remember. No one yet understood that from that moment forward, certain phone calls in the city no longer had only 2 people listening. At 9 o'clock that night, the Meridian was gradually emptying. Alina was carrying a dessert tray toward the final table when someone turned up the television behind the bar, and the entire room seemed to be pulled toward the flat screen where red letters raced across the bottom. Breaking news. Daylight assassination attempt. William Barone, suspected head of Chicago's Underworld, serves ambush on the avenue. The female anchor spoke evenly about the Barone Holdings empire, about suspicions stretching back 2 decades, and about the secretive heir who had never appeared before the media. Then she announced that his image had been released for the first time that day. The screen changed, and his face filled the entire frame, captured at close range by a reporter's camera, as he stepped from the vehicle and entered the office building, every feature painfully clear. That jaw, those dark, frighteningly alert eyes, the faint scar at his temple, the face that had collapsed against her shoulder during the snowstorm, the face she had bandaged with the restaurant's first aid kit, the face that rose every morning, with a grimace from a sofa 8 inches too short, the face that had rested its chin against her hair, in this very kitchen 3 nights earlier. The tray slipped from Alina's hands. The sound of porcelain shattering across the stone floor rang through the dining room, cream spreading over the tiles. Someone cried out. Dana rushed toward her. But Alina could no longer hear anything. She stood among the broken pieces, her eyes fixed on the screen, where the name William Barone appeared again and again beneath Ray's face, and inside her mind, every scattered detail from the past 3 months began crashing together with such speed that she felt she might be sick. The anonymous owner of the Meridian had never revealed his face. A single call from a security guard had forced an entire corporation to retrieve camera footage within 30 minutes. A security guard had known the license numbers and illegal interest rates of the Kowalski pawn shop by heart. An anonymous trust had purchased a waitress's $60,000 debt at 0% interest. An unprecedented invitation naming her as guest of honor had come directly from the owner's office. A pearl necklace recognized by the entire upper class as a Barone family heirloom. A housekeeper who could make 200 people part before her like water and force Francesca Salerno to turn pale and step back. A housekeeper with her own bodyguards. A housekeeper whom the security guard called Mother. Mother. Alina heard herself breathing, slow and strangely loud beneath the blurred sounds around her. Dana was shaking her shoulder and asking something. Gordon was watching from across the room, with a new and absolute terror in his eyes. Alina bent down, picked up each shard of porcelain, placed it carefully on the tray with hands that didn't tremble, apologized to the Gessens in an even voice, walked into the changing room, folded her uniform, put on her coat, and left the restaurant through the employee entrance like a sleepwalker guided by discipline. During the entire 40-minute ride on the number 8 bus, she didn't cry, didn't call anyone, and didn't read the dozens of messages lighting up her phone one after another. She only sat upright, with both hands resting on her knees, watching the city pass beyond the rain-streaked window, while a single thought repeated endlessly in her mind. She had told him about her father. She had told him that the people she hated most were those who lied to someone who trusted them. He had looked directly into her eyes and said he understood. He understood while the name she had spoken hundreds of times each day wasn't his name at all. He understood while the old woman she had taken home from the sidewalk was the matriarch of an empire. He understood while her 430-square-foot apartment had spent 3 months as the stage for a play, in which both actors knew every line, while the only person in the audience didn't even know she was watching a performance. The bus stopped. She stepped off, walked 3 blocks through the drizzle without opening her umbrella, climbed 3 flights of stairs, crossed the loose 9th step where he always placed a hand behind her back, and stopped before the door to her own apartment. Inside, the television was playing the same news report. Then the television abruptly went silent. Then came nothing, the silence of people who already knew. Alina stood outside the door for 10 seconds, then 20, her hand resting on the cold doorknob. Finally, she turned it and pushed the door open. In the yellow glow of the room that had once felt like the warmest place in the world, the 2 of them stood waiting for her. The tall man whose face had filled every screen in the city, and the old woman with ash-gray eyes watching her, with the pain of someone who knew what was about to happen. Both opened their mouths to speak, and Alina raised one hand, only one, silencing every sound before it could become a word. Alina lowered her hand very slowly, stepped inside, and closed the door behind her. The small click of the lock echoed through the room like a judge's gavel. She removed her wet coat and hung it neatly on the hook, exactly as she did every day, then turned to face them. It was that calmness, rather than tears or shouting, that made William Barone feel the ground beginning to split beneath his feet. Alina, he took 1 step toward her. Let me, William. She spoke his name, his real name, for the first time, and it fell between them like the edge of a blade. William Barone. Did I say it correctly? That's how they pronounced it on television. He stopped. The air in the room was so thick that they could hear the faint drizzle tapping against the window, the heater ticking, and the breathing of 3 people. I want to ask you a few questions. You only need to answer yes or no. Don't explain. Please, don't explain. She sat on the edge of the sofa, his sofa that was 5 feet 11 inches long, both hands resting on her knees, her back straight, as though she were sitting through an interview for the rest of her life. The Meridian belongs to you? One beat passed. Yes. The watch, the security footage, Whitney's transfer, that was you? Yes. My debt, the anonymous trust, the boxes containing my mother's things, that was you? Yes. The invitation to the gala was you. The night of the snowstorm, you were injured because someone was hunting you, not because of an accident. The money you left behind was enough for me to stop working for 3 years. And the name Ray. For the first time, her voice wavered slightly. Even the name I called you every day was never real. Ray is my middle name, Raymond. Only my mother calls. Don't. She closed her eyes for 1 second. Don't give me 1% of the truth now. It's worse than the lie. Silence followed. Outside the window, the headlights of a passing car swept across the ceiling and disappeared. William stood in the room where he had learned what a home felt like, his hands, which had signed contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars, hanging helplessly at his sides, and he did the only thing left for him to do. I'm sorry, I know. Alina opened her eyes, and beneath the yellow light they were frighteningly dry. I believe you're truly sorry. That's the saddest part, William. You're sincerely sorry, and yet you still did it. Every day, for almost 3 months. She rose and walked to the window, looking down at the wet street where she had once guided an old woman through the rain. When she spoke again, her voice was so quiet that the other two had to hold their breath to hear her. I'm not crying because you're Mafia. I spent 40 minutes on that bus asking myself what frightened me most, and I realized it wasn't that. Your world terrifies me, but fear is something people can overcome. She turned around, and only then did 2 tears finally roll down her cheeks without a single sob. I'm crying because you lived in my home. You ate the soup I cooked. You watched me bring home every portion of leftovers from your own restaurant. You watched me sit at this table, counting every dollar in tips, writing every number in my notebook, skipping lunch so I could repay a debt that was nothing more than pocket change to you. You held the declaration I wrote promising that I wouldn't ask you for a penny. You read it 3 times. I counted, William. 3 times, and you still said nothing. You let me feel ashamed of my poverty in front of a billionaire pretending to be unemployed. Do you know? She stopped, and the silence stretched so long that William felt each passing second cutting into his skin. My father was the same. He never hit my mother. He only sat down every evening for 11 years and ate the meals she cooked, praised the food, asked about her day, while living an entirely different life behind her back. My mother died still believing he was only away on business. I spent my whole life swearing I would never become my mother. Yet for the past 3 months, I've lived exactly as she did without even knowing it. You're exactly like my father, William. The only difference is that you're richer. The words weren't loud, but William Barone stumbled half a step backward as though he had been shot at close range. The face that had remained motionless before the barrel of a gun turned deathly pale. His lips parted, but no sound came out. Alina wiped her face with the back of her hand. A clean, decisive movement, then turned toward the corner where Mena had been sitting still as a statue from the beginning, her old hands tightly clasped in her lap. And you, Mama. Alina's voice softened, and that tenderness was the cruelest part of all. I brought you home from the sidewalk. I gave you my only bed. I called you Mama Mina. She swallowed. How long have you known? Since the gala, or since your son kicked down my door? Mina lifted her head, and in those ash-gray eyes there was no denial, only exhaustion as deep as the bottom of a well. She slowly stood, walked to her cloth bag, removed a small object and placed a cold piece of silver in Alina's palm. Alina recognized it immediately. The lighter engraved with the initials TB, the one she had kept inside the bag of memories beneath her bed, where no one had permission to touch it. Since the 2nd week, child. Her voice was even and bare, without pleading or decoration. I searched through your belongings because I suspected you had been planted by an enemy to get close to me. I found this. It belonged to Tonio. I gave it to his younger brother on the day of the funeral. The moment I saw it inside your bag, I knew the child you were carrying was my grandchild. I knew before you did, and before William did. And I remained silent. The room seemed to turn slowly around Alina. She looked down at the lighter in her hand, then at the woman she had loved like a mother, then at the man she had loved as she had never loved anyone before. A small, unfamiliar laugh escaped her, a sound that wounded them both more deeply than any crying could have done. The second week, so all that time, inside this 430-square-foot room, all 3 members of your family, including the baby inside me, knew who they were. I was the only fool playing the part of the homeowner, Alina. Mina stepped forward, but Alina moved backward, one step, then another, one hand instinctively covering her stomach, the most primitive protective gesture of a mother. That movement froze both William and Mina more completely than any wall could have done. "Don't," she said softly. "Neither of you. Don't follow me." She took her still damp coat from the hook, put it on, and wrapped her scarf around her neck, doing everything with the slow, precise movements of someone using every ounce of strength not to shatter. Then she opened the door. On the threshold, she paused for half a second without turning around. "Congratulations to the whole family. You're reunited now." The door closed behind her. It didn't slam. It simply closed gently and decisively, and the quiet click of the lock sounded through the room, like something enormous breaking apart. Through the third-floor window, the 2 people carrying the Barone name stood motionless, watching her small figure step into the drizzle beneath the yellow streetlights, one hand holding the collar of her coat closed, the other never leaving her stomach. She walked straight ahead, without looking back, until she disappeared around the corner. Inside the room that had once been the warmest place in Chicago, the most powerful man in the city stood among old furnishings that had suddenly become hollow and meaningless. After a very long silence, he finally opened his mouth, his voice raw and hoarse. "Mother, what am I supposed to do now, and Mena?" The woman of steel who had buried a husband and a son, who had rebuilt an entire family from ashes, stood watching the rain swallow the second daughter of her life, and answered with words she had never spoken to her son in 36 years. "I don't know, child. This time, I truly don't know." Alina emailed her resignation the very next morning. 4 lines, no accusations, no explanation, and she refused the full month of severance pay, even after the corporation's human resources department called 3 times to plead with her to accept it. She moved into Dana Whitfield's living room in Bridgeport, spread a mattress beside a potted plant, taped her mother's photograph to the wall, and began again from the number she knew better than any other in her life. 0. Dana's old oven became her means of survival. Alina baked apple pies, butter cookies, and banana bread, photographed them with a phone whose screen was cracked, posted the pictures online, and accepted delivery orders within a 3-mile radius. None of her customers knew that the baker delivering their orders by bus was carrying the heir to the largest empire in Chicago. Just as no one knew that every evening, while she stood kneading dough beside the window, a gray sedan was parked at the end of the street beneath the endless spring rain, and the man inside sat there from 9 o'clock until well past midnight, night after night, for 2 straight weeks. He didn't ring the bell. He didn't send another message after the first one was left unread. He didn't use any of the power in his hands to force a door to open. The man who could have purchased the entire block simply sat in the car and looked up at the lighted window where her shadow moved behind the curtain, visibly thinner than before, and at exactly midnight, he started the engine and drove away. Polly sat in the driver's seat on those nights, silent as duty required, until one evening he glanced into the rearview mirror and saw something that made him forget to blink. The boss's right hand, the hand that had signed orders of punishment without trembling a single fraction of an inch for 16 years, was shaking faintly on his knee when the light in that window suddenly went dark. "Boss," Polly said quietly, stepping beyond his place for the first time in his life, "let me go up and knock. I'll kneel and beg her for you if that's what it takes." "No," William kept his eyes on the dark window, his voice sinking low. "She told me not to follow her. I took away her right to know the truth, Polly. I won't take away her right to be angry too." Mina was the one who broke the stalemate. One Thursday afternoon, she appeared outside Dana's door without bodyguards or jewelry, only an old woman in a worn coat carrying a container of homemade chicken soup. When Dana opened the door in confusion, Alina was standing behind the kitchen counter with flour covering both hands. The 2 women looked at each other across the room for a very long time. Then Alina quietly told Dana that it was all right and asked her to let Mena inside. Mena sat down, placed the soup on the table, and didn't touch the tea Dana poured for her. She spoke plainly, because she knew she no longer had the right to speak in circles. I didn't come to ask you to forgive William. He's a grown man, and he'll pay for his own sins. I came to tell you the rest of what neither television nor he will ever be able to explain, and afterward, you may judge him however you wish." Then she told the story in the even voice of someone turning through the pages of her own case file. 16 years earlier, her husband, William's father, had been shot to death on the steps of a church after Sunday morning mass, in front of his wife and children. The man behind it had been the family's most trusted partner. Do you know what broke me that week? It wasn't the death. Our family was already familiar with death. It was the doors. 3 days after the funeral, the Salerno family, our future in-laws, who had promised their daughter to William when they were both still in high school, sent a handwritten letter ending the engagement because the two families were no longer considered equal. Friends of 30 years stopped answering their phones. My husband's empire shook like a termite-eaten house in a storm. Vultures filled the sky, and standing in the middle of it all was my 20-year-old son, a second-year architecture student who had once dreamed of building theaters and libraries. He sat inside his father's office through the night, and when he walked out the next morning, that child no longer existed. He had 3 months to learn how to make people fear him, or everyone in our family would die. He killed his own heart to keep the rest of us alive, child. I stood there and watched him do it. I, his mother, didn't stop him, because I needed to survive too. She turned the untouched cup of tea slowly between her hands. After that, he never trusted anyone again. He believed every person who came near him had a price, because life had proven it to him. Then a girl bandaged his wound during a snowstorm without asking his full name, returned every dollar he had left behind, and wrote a promise saying she didn't need a penny from him. You destroyed every point of reference he had, do you understand? I won't defend the fact that he hid the truth from you, but I understand why he did it. He wasn't afraid of embarrassment. He was afraid of something else. The first woman he dared to love was the woman who hated dishonesty more than anything in the world, while his truth was something that could turn both you and the baby into targets. He was trapped between two kinds of death, child. He chose the slower one. He would rather lose you than watch you die. Only the sound of rain striking the gutter remained in the room. Lena sat motionless, the flour on her hands now dry, her eyes fixed on the container of chicken soup, sending up a thin thread of steam. At last, she asked the only question she had. "And you? Did you have some life or death reason for knowing this baby was your grandchild from the second week, yet still sitting at my table and eating the food I cooked every night as though nothing had happened?" Mena looked at her, and this time, the woman of steel searched for no excuse. "No, I have no decent reason. I have only one ugly truth. I was afraid. For 6 years after Tonio died, I lived like a corpse that had somehow learned to walk. Then suddenly, heaven dropped into my life a daughter who gave me her only meal, called me mother, and carried my family's blood inside her. I knew that the moment I opened my mouth and told you the truth, that miracle would shatter. So I remained silent. I was greedy, child. After 6 years, I finally had a daughter again, someone I could be afraid of losing, and it was that fear of losing you that made me lose you." Her ash-gray eyes didn't weep, but they had sunk as deep as 2 dry wells. Looking into them, Alina saw both the mother on the West Randolph sidewalk and the woman who had deceived her, and the 2 images refused to separate. "I can't hate you." At last she spoke, her voice exhausted. "I've tried for 2 weeks, but I can't hate you. I still can't look at either of you the way I did before. I need time, Mama Minna. I can't promise how much." Mina nodded and rose. Before leaving, she paused and rested one aged hand against the kitchen doorframe without turning around. The chicken soup was simmered with ginger. It's the best thing for nausea at this stage. Don't skip meals. Then she left, her back still straight as she descended each step, and only when she reached the sidewalk beneath the rain did the woman of steel permit her shoulders to sag for exactly 3 seconds. That same evening, nearly 7 miles away, inside the 2-story house in Cicero, Darlene Pruitt was watching the news report of the failed assassination attempt for the 20th time. Her thumb rubbed across the screen as she enlarged the face filling the frame, the face of the man who had leaned toward Brett and spoken a few words that turned the entire Kowalski family pale, the man who had draped his coat over her niece's shoulders beneath a street lamp. A smile slowly crawled across her red-painted lips. She searched through her contacts and called an acquaintance who styled hair for wealthy clients. That woman connected her with someone else, and 3 days later, in a discreet cafe in Gold Coast, Darlene Pruitt sat across from a beautiful, cold-faced woman wearing a cream-colored coat and pushed a paper envelope across the table. Inside was Dana's address in Bridgeport, Alina's daily delivery schedule, the girl's phone number, and a photograph of a 16-week ultrasound that Darlene had secretly taken from Dana's social media account. Written beneath it in red ink were the words, "That's my grandniece or grandnephew, Barone's child. Pay the right price, and all of it belongs to you." Francesca Salerno opened the envelope and examined each item without changing her expression, then placed a second, thicker envelope filled with cash on the table. As Darlene eagerly snatched it up, Francesca rose, fastened the buttons of her coat, and spoke in a tone as light as though she were complimenting the weather. "Your family is fascinating. One of you gives away her last meal to a stranger, while another sells her own niece for an envelope. The same blood, and yet so different, isn't it?" Then she walked away, her heels striking the stone floor in an even rhythm, leaving Darlene seated there with the money in her hands and a sentence she couldn't understand, yet somehow couldn't escape, not even after she had returned home. In the rooftop greenhouse of the old hotel, Francesca placed Darlene's paper envelope on the tea table before Lev Volkov and spoke with the clipped precision of someone reading a telegram. "Barone's weakness is 4.5 months pregnant. She has broken things off with him, quit her job, and moved into her friend's home in Bridgeport. Most importantly, no one is protecting her. He respects her demand that he keep his distance, so all he dares to do is park at the end of the street every night. The door you need is standing wide open." Volkov turned over each item in the envelope with the tips of his fingers as though dealing cards, lingering longest over the ultrasound photograph. What crossed his face wasn't delight, but the careful consideration of a chess player who had just been handed a queen, a pregnant woman. "I don't touch pregnant women, Miss Salerno. I have principles." He poured himself more tea. "But I don't need to touch her. I only need to borrow her and keep her sitting quietly in one place for 48 hours. The rest, American law will do for me, far more cleanly." The plan was assembled over 3 days, and the chosen link was the person no one would suspect precisely because she seemed so harmless. Dana Whitfield. Dana's former husband, a gambling addict who had divorced her but never divorced his debts, still owed Volkov's people $43,000. One evening, 2 men whose politeness was more frightening than any threat waited for Dana outside her home. They showed her photographs of her former husband, photographs of her son's elementary school, then offered her something simple. All she had to do was ask her baker friend to accept a delivery order, an entirely ordinary task. No one would be harmed. Half the boy's father's debt would be erased. But if she refused, they would be deeply sorry about whatever might happen to a gambler who didn't know how to behave. Dana cried through the night and the following morning, with eyes swollen enough that Alina assumed she had lost sleep because her son was ill. She passed along news of a large order. A regular customer from Dana's former workplace wanted baked goods for her grandson's first birthday party, a 2-tier vanilla cake and 60 cookies, delivered on Saturday afternoon. They would pay triple because of the short notice. The address was in an old warehouse district on the southwest side, where they had converted a former workshop into an event space. That industrial style was very fashionable now, Dana explained. Alina, who needed every dollar she could save for the birth, accepted immediately and even baked an extra batch of ginger cookies as a gift for the baby. On Saturday afternoon, a taxi dropped her outside a silent row of red brick warehouses. Carrying 2 boxes of baked goods, she passed through the partly open iron gate according to the instructions in the message and called out, "Hello, is anyone here?" Her voice echoed through the vast warehouse, where only dust floated inside slanting columns of sunlight. By the time she realized there were no balloons, no party tables, and no child anywhere inside, the iron gate behind her had already begun sliding shut with a long metallic shriek. No one touched her, and that was the first thing that frightened Alina in a strangely different way. 2 men and a middle-aged woman emerged from an office at the far end of the warehouse, all of them so polite it made her skin crawl. They invited her into a room that had already been prepared with a twin bed, clean blankets, a water table, an electric heater, a case of bottled water, even a basket of fruit and the exact brand of prenatal vitamins she used. The woman explained in an even voice that Alina should rest comfortably. If she needed anything, she could knock and someone would bring it. She shouldn't do anything foolish, because there was only one exit, and it was always guarded. Then they closed the door, and the sound of the outside lock turning twice landed like two final periods. Alina stood in the middle of the room, with both cake boxes still in her hands, and fear seeped into her not through violence, but through that very thoughtfulness. People only prepared prenatal vitamins for a hostage when they had already calculated that they would keep her long enough to need her healthy. She sat on the edge of the bed with both hands around her stomach, listening to the steady footsteps patrolling the hallway and watching a shadow pass through the strip of light beneath the door every 4 minutes. She whispered to the baby inside her, forcing her voice not to break. "It's all right, sweetheart. Mama's here." Everything's all right. Her phone had been taken at the gate, and that same phone sent a message to William's number later that evening through an encrypted messaging application. It contained a photograph of Alina sitting on the bed inside the clean room, safe and physically unharmed. There was no written threat. Instead, exactly 1 minute later, a voice call came through. William was standing in his office on the 39th floor when the courteous voice with its Russian accent poured into his ear, slow and precise as someone reading a contract. "Good evening, Mr. Barone. First, allow me to reassure you. Miss Monroe is being cared for better than she was at home. She has heat, vitamins, and someone guarding her sleep. Not a single hair on her head will be harmed. I am a man of principle where pregnant women are concerned. Second, my proposal is very simple. At 10 o'clock on Monday morning, you will hold a press conference and announce two things. Barone Holdings will merge its entire port and transportation division into a joint venture with my partners, and you will publicly announce your engagement to Miss Francesca Salerno, reuniting the two families. That is all. But if you refuse, or if I see even the shadow of one of your men anywhere near the southwest side," a faint smile entered his voice. "I won't do anything to her, Mr. Barone. I am a civilized man. I will simply call my federal friends, who have become very enthusiastic lately, and surrender Miss Monroe to them along with a complete file, accurate down to the final seal. Accounts in her name receiving money from 3 of your own shell companies. An anonymous trust suspiciously erasing $60,000 of debt, records showing her entering and leaving Barone properties. An accomplice to money laundering, Mr. Barone. In the present climate of hunting organized crime, she will wait for trial without bail, and your child will be born inside the medical ward of a federal prison. You have 48 hours. Think carefully." The call ended. The office on the 39th floor became so silent that Polly, standing 3 steps from the desk, could hear the second hand of the clock. He watched his boss remain motionless beside the glass wall, the city glittering beneath him, the phone still pressed to his ear long after the other line had gone dead. 1 minute passed, then 2. Polly prepared himself for the worst storm of the past 16 years, for the order to tear apart the entire southwest side, for total war. But when William finally lowered the phone and turned around, there was no storm on his face. It was so perfectly still that it chilled the blood more than any rage could have done. He removed his watch and placed it on the desk, undid his cuff links, rolled up his sleeves like a surgeon preparing for a long operation, and gave Polly a single order. Prepare the press conference, at midnight on Sunday, inside a private room behind a law office in the Loop. 3 desk lamps illuminated a meeting that appeared on no official calendar. On one side of the table sat William Barone with the family's 2 most senior attorneys. Across from them sat a woman with salt and pepper hair in an unmarked gray suit, a face the entire country knew from major trials, the United States Attorney for the Northern District of Illinois. She had come in response to a proposal she had assumed she must have misheard when the intermediary attorney first delivered it. "Let me make certain I understand you correctly, Mr. Barone," she said, never taking her eyes from the thick stack of gray-bound files that had just been pushed across the table. "You approached me voluntarily. Open it first." She did, and for the next 20 minutes, the only sound in the room was the turning of pages. There were diagrams of a human trafficking route moving people across the Canadian border inside refrigerated trucks. Debt ledgers from a lending network charging interest rates so extreme that the prosecutor had to read them twice. Lists of regular payments flowing into the pockets of 3 licensing officials. Schedules, license plate numbers, ship names, container numbers, all of it revolving around one name, Lev Volkov. If these materials can be verified, they're enough to build the largest federal case this city has seen in a decade, she said slowly, then looked up, her gaze sharp as a scalpel. But I don't believe in free gifts, Mr. Barone. What is your price? Immunity? Not for me. William remained motionless, his hands interlaced on the table, and continued in the voice of a man who had finished thinking long before he entered the room. What I need is written in the proposal at the end of the file. A court-approved path, supervised by your office, allowing Barone Holdings to separate and liquidate every unlawful division and bring everything remaining into complete transparency within 3 years. I will cooperate fully, disclose everything, testify, and accept every financial penalty. In exchange, I'm asking for only 2 things. The innocent wage-earning employees inside the system must have their jobs protected, and a woman named Alina Monroe, along with the child she is carrying, must never be connected to any criminal charge in any record. She is innocent. I need the law of this country to know that before 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, the prosecutor studied the man across from her for a long time. The man her office had pursued for a decade without finding a single opening, now sitting before her and dismantling his own empire brick by brick. Then she asked one final question, no longer as a matter of procedure. You're surrendering what your family built over 3 generations. For what? William looked down at his hands, and for the first time that night, warmth entered his voice. Because I've just realized that for 16 years, I was protecting the wrong thing. At that same hour, inside the red brick warehouse on the southwest side, the door to Alina's room opened, and Francesca Salerno entered on sharp heels, carrying the scent of expensive perfume and the smile of someone arriving to admire a trophy. She sat in the room's only chair, crossed her legs, and studied Alina, who was sitting upright on the edge of the bed. I only came to see how you were doing. Tomorrow is a very important day. At 10 o'clock in the morning, he'll stand before the entire city and announce his engagement to me. You should watch it on television. There's a signal here. I made sure of that. Do you truly believe that? Alina asked quietly, and it was that calmness that made the other woman's smile stiffen for half a beat. You have guns, people, and even tomorrow's stage. You can force a performance, Francesca. You can't force his heart. 16 years ago, when his family was bleeding and had lost everything, your family sent a letter ending the engagement because the 2 sides were no longer considered equal. When his hands were empty, you abandoned him. Now that they're full, you've come back demanding his name, and you call that love? I'm a poor waitress, yes, but between the 2 of us, I'm the only person William Barone ever trusted with the most vulnerable truth of his life, on a night when he was wounded and collapsed in an alley without a single bodyguard. Marry the Barone name if you can. You'll never have the man. Francesca shot to her feet, and for 1 second, the perfect finish on her face cracked open and revealed what lay beneath. It wasn't anger, but an old and hollow emptiness. Then she turned and walked out, closing the door harder than necessary, and the fading sound of her heels no longer resembled the footsteps of someone who was winning. Across the city, inside the empty nave of an old stone church, where only rows of red candles flickered before the saints, Mena Baroni knelt in the front pew, the same place where 16 years earlier, her husband had fallen on the steps outside. She lit a new candle and placed it beside a small photograph of the grinning young man on the beach, then spoke to the flame in the voice of someone talking to her child across a very distant line. Tonio, listen to your mother. Tomorrow, your brother will stand before the whole world and tear down everything your father built, the empire you left home because you hated, the shadow you would rather die on a sidewalk than return to live beneath. He's destroying it for a girl who fed me when I was hungry, child. A girl you should had the chance to meet. I'm sorry it took me 30 years to understand you. The flame trembled beneath a current of air from nowhere, and the woman of steel clasped her aged hands before her chest, speaking the final words with the first smile she had worn in 6 years whenever she said her eldest son's name. And I'm proud of him, of both my sons. Sleep well, my boy. At 10 o'clock on Monday morning, the grand ballroom of the downtown hotel was packed with 300 people, while a forest of cameras from every television station in the city pointed toward the wooden podium bearing the Barone Holdings logo. Rumors of a historic announcement had leaked the night before, leaving both the financial world and the press holding their breath. In the front row, Francesca Salerno sat in an ivory gown, chosen with obsessive care down to the final stitch, Her hair swept into an elegant bridal style, as though she were moments away from having her engagement announced. Her phone rested on her lap with a message to Volkov already written, waiting only for her finger to press send. Meanwhile, inside the room in the warehouse on the southwest side, Alina sat before the small television they had deliberately turned up loud, both hands cradling her stomach, her heart beating in time with every second passing on the clock in the corner of the screen. At exactly 10:03, William Barone stepped onto the platform without notes or a teleprompter, dressed in a black suit as though attending the funeral of his own empire. The entire ballroom fell silent when he leaned toward the cluster of microphones. "I have 3 announcements. I will make them once, and I won't answer questions." He raised his head, and the cameras captured the unwavering darkness of his eyes. "First, for several weeks, there have been rumors that the engagement between my family and the Salerno family would be restored. I am declaring before all of you that from this moment forward, every relationship between the Barone family and the Salerno family, business, social, and marital, is permanently terminated. The Salernos betrayed my family 16 years ago when my father had barely been laid to rest, and this week, they repeated that betrayal in an even more despicable way. As far as I am concerned, they no longer exist." A roar of shock swept through the ballroom. Dozens of cameras swung toward the front row, where Francesca sat rigid, the smile of a future bride frozen across her lips like a crack. Her fingers frantically pressed send on the warning message, and William waited until the noise had settled before continuing. "Second, as of 9 o'clock this morning, under notarized legal instruments, every legitimate asset belonging to Barone Holdings, including 4 restaurants, 2 hotels, the real estate fund, and every share held in my personal name, has been transferred irrevocably into a trust. That trust bears the names of the only woman I have ever loved, and the child we are waiting to welcome, Alina Monroe." This time, the press conference truly exploded. Reporters leaped from their seats, arms shooting into the air, and someone shouted, asking who she was. Inside the warehouse, Alina sprang to her feet beside the bed, both hands covering her mouth as tears poured through her fingers before she could stop them. On the screen, William remained upright like a pillar of stone in the storm of camera flashes. "She is the woman who taught me that a meal given away at the right moment is worth more than everything I own. Anyone who believed that holding her hostage would force me to kneel now has my answer. She is wealthier than I am, and I have nothing left for you to use against me." He bent down, lifted a familiar stack of gray-bound files from beneath the podium, and dropped it heavily onto the surface before the microphones. The hard sound of wood echoed through every television speaker in the city. "Third, these documents are copies, the originals containing complete evidence of Mr. Lev Volkov's human trafficking network, predatory lending operation, and bribery of public officials, have been on the FBI's desk since midnight, accompanied by my sworn testimony. Mr. Volkov, I know you're watching. You told me that you are a man of principle. So am I, in the rooftop greenhouse." Lev Volkov stood motionless before the screen for exactly 3 seconds. Then he turned toward his assistant, and for the first time in 30 years, a fracture appeared in his carefully tempered voice. "Get the girl out of there immediately. Move her to the secondary location. Go." But the order had come 11 hours too late, because both Volkov and Francesca had forgotten one thing: the dry official announcement that had drifted across the news after the ambush, authorizing electronic surveillance of communications involving anyone connected to the relevant parties. The first person placed on that list had been the woman who once turned in her chair inside a penthouse and sang the name Alina Monroe into her phone while speaking to an unsaved number. That call, along with every call that followed about the warehouse, the guard schedule, and the 48-hour deadline, had been recorded directly inside a federal technical operations room. At 3 o'clock that morning, once William had signed the cooperation agreement, the coordinates of the red brick warehouse district had been circled in red on the tactical map. 4 minutes after Volkov's panicked order, before anyone inside the warehouse could touch the handle of Alina's door, the artificial darkness created by the sheets of metal covering the windows was torn apart by floodlights from 4 directions. Loudspeakers thundered through the building. "FBI, everyone down. Face to the floor. Hands behind your head." Armored figures bearing the 3 yellow letters flooded through the iron gates in a pincer formation, guided by Paulie's men. The guards dropped their weapons and surrendered without a single shot being fired. The first person to force open the door to Alina's room wasn't an agent, but Paulie Ritchie himself. The towering man who hadn't known fear in 15 years dropped to his knees before Alina, who was pressed against the wall, and raised both hands so she could see they were empty. His voice broke as he spoke. "Miss Monroe, it's me, Paulie. I work for William. You're safe now. We're taking you out first. A doctor is waiting outside. Hold on to my shoulder. Slowly now. One step at a time." Alina was guided from the warehouse through a separate route that had already been cleared, wrapped in a thermal blanket so she wouldn't have to see anything happening behind her, where handcuffs were closing one after another around every captor's wrists. In the flower-filled greenhouse atop the old hotel, Lev Volkov slowly placed his unfinished cup of tea on the table, watched the armored figures appear beyond the misted glass, and remained seated as they approached, like an aging chess master, calmly acknowledging that the game was over. The vehicle carrying William tore across half the city and braked hard in front of the barricades surrounding the red brick warehouse district. He threw himself out before the wheels had fully stopped, pushing through armored agents and the blue and red flashes spreading across the rain-slick pavement, his eyes searching wildly through the sea of people until he saw her beside the open doors of an ambulance, a small figure wrapped in a silver thermal blanket, her hair disheveled, her face pale but unharmed. Alina. He stopped 3 steps away, not daring to come any closer. The man who had dismantled an entire empire before 300 cameras only an hour earlier now stood as awkwardly as an 18-year-old boy, and the only words that escaped his throat came out raw and hoarse. "I was too late." Alina looked up at him, at the man who had stood before the whole world, and called her the only woman he had ever loved, who had torn down with his own hands the fortress he had spent 16 years building, in exchange for the door to her prison, and every wall she had built over the past 2 weeks trembled to its foundations. She shook her head, tears falling even as a fragile smile appeared on her lips. "No, this time, you came exactly when I needed you." The remaining 3 steps vanished in half a second. William dropped to his knees on the wet pavement and wrapped both arms around her, holding her so tightly that she could hear his heart pounding wildly through his suit. One hand embraced her shoulders, while the other spread protectively across her stomach like a shield, and amid the flashing lights of federal vehicles, people watched the most feared man in Chicago bury his face in the hair of a baker and tremble like a child. At the hospital, she was taken directly to the maternity ward, and the 40 minutes William spent waiting in the corridor became the longest 40 minutes of his life. He paced without stopping, refusing to sit and refusing water, until the female doctor stepped outside, removed her mask, and smiled. "The baby is fine. The heartbeat is strong. The mother only needs a few days of rest. They're both all right." Inside the room, the ultrasound probe moved across Alina's stomach, and the rapid rhythm of the baby's heartbeat filled the air like a young horse racing over an open field. William stood motionless beside the bed, his eyes fixed on the black and white screen, where a tiny body stretched and curled, hearing his child's heartbeat for the first time, while 2 streams of tears ran down his face, tears he didn't bother to wipe away. Mena, who had just arrived under Paulie's escort, stood at the foot of the bed with both hands clasped before her chest as though she were inside a church, her lips moving in a silent prayer of gratitude. She didn't leave that night. She pulled a chair beside the bed and held Alina's hand between both of her aged hands, and every time Alina startled awake from a dream filled with the sound of a lock turning, those hands tightened gently and that familiar voice rose through the darkness. "Mama is here. Go back to sleep, child. No one will ever touch you or your baby again." In the days that followed, the outside world rearranged itself through the brief news reports Dana read beside the hospital bed. Lev Volkov was indicted by a federal grand jury on 17 charges and ordered held without bail. Francesca Salerno was arrested at the airport with a one-way ticket to Milan on charges of conspiracy to commit kidnapping, and the Salerno family publicly disowned her. Darlene Pruitt was summoned for questioning after selling private information to criminals, and was forced to put her house on the market to pay for an attorney. Whitney Hale was fired by the corporation and sued, and no restaurant in the city would hire her. Alina listened to all of it without making a single comment. She only looked toward the window where the late spring sunlight was rising, then asked Dana to turn it off. That part of her life was over. On the afternoon of the third day, when they were finally alone, Alina told William to sit in the chair beside her bed. He sat with his back straight and his hands resting on his knees, obedient as a student, waiting to receive his final grade. "I forgive you." His shoulders had only just fallen with relief when she raised one finger. "Wait. My forgiveness comes with conditions, and those conditions aren't negotiable. First, from this day forward, no more lies, large or small. Not even if you believe you're protecting me. No matter how ugly the truth is, I can endure it. What I can't endure is being deceived. If you lie to me again, even once, I will dismiss you immediately from both positions, husband and father, without warning and without a second chance. Is that clear?" "Accepted," he answered without blinking. "Second, I won't touch the trust. One day it will belong to our child. I'm going back to work. I'll keep baking, and I'll open a shop with my own hands. I won't sit around playing Mrs. Barone while people point at me. Don't try to stop me. I wouldn't dare." The corner of his mouth moved. "To tell you the truth, all the assets are in your name now, so technically, I'm unemployed and living in your home for the second time." Alina laughed aloud, the first true laugh she had given in 2 weeks, then extended her hand as though they were finalizing a contract. "Then we have an agreement. Position applied for, husband and father. Probationary period 1 lifetime. Salary 3 home-cooked meals a day. Bonus, a packed lunch to take with you. And one last condition," her voice softened into something almost like a vow. "Never kneel before me out of guilt again. The next time you kneel, it must be for a beautiful reason." "I'll be waiting." William took the small hand that still carried the faint scent of antiseptic, received those words like the sweetest command of his life, and nodded gently. Then, inside his mind, he began drawing the plans for the next time he would kneel. 6 months later, at 3 o'clock in the morning on an early autumn day, the kitchen light came on inside a quiet townhouse in Lincoln Park, and the man who had once made all of Chicago hold its breath stood before a bottle warmer. With his eyes half closed, his sleeves rolled high, muttering the formula instructions to himself, as though reading the terms of a contract, because upstairs, his tiny daughter, Stella Barone, now 2 months old and blessed with ash-gray eyes exactly like her grandmother's, had begun crying for her midnight feeding, and in William's new world, that cry was the highest command of all, more important than any meeting he had ever led. He carried his daughter against his shoulder, pacing back and forth while soothing her in his deep and awkward voice. And from the bedroom doorway, the 2 women of his life stood watching. Alina covered her smile with the sleeve of her robe, while Mena offered a final judgment that made everyone in the house struggle not to laugh out loud. "It took 36 years, child, but I've finally seen him do something properly. All the trials had ended by summer, and the old world had truly been cleared of guns. Barone Holdings, now following its court-supervised path toward complete transparency, consisted only of restaurants, hotels, and a charitable foundation that grew larger with every passing month. That morning, the entire family gathered at the corner of West Randolph, where everything had begun, to cut the ribbon on a very special place called Tonio's Table, a community dining room for people experiencing homelessness. Yet it was unlike any charitable kitchen the city had ever seen. Inside were tables covered with spotless white cloths, gleaming silverware, and fresh flowers arranged in glass vases. Every guest who entered was served at the table, addressed as Sir or Mom, and asked with sincere courtesy, "Would you prefer soup or salad first today?" On the main brick wall, a line engraved in bronze glowed quietly beneath the light. "Here, no one has to prove they deserve a hot meal." Mena Barone, the matriarch of the family, wore a white apron and personally carried steaming plates of stew to every table, bowing to each guest in worn clothing, with the same dignity she had once reserved for heads of state. In the dishwashing area at the back, a familiar face worked steadily, rinsing every plate one by one. Gordon Ames, the man who had once used a hose to drive an old woman away, had come asking for work after losing everything, and Mena had accepted him on one condition. Before every shift, he had to personally carry breakfast outside and offer it to the people he had once chased away. People said he did it every morning, with his head bowing lower each day and his eyes growing less cold. In the middle of the opening celebration, while the guests of honor, the same invisible people who had once gathered at that street corner, ate beneath the gentle sound of piano music, William suddenly set down his glass and walked to the center of the dining room. Before his mother, Dana, Polly holding baby Stella, and dozens of guests who had stopped with their spoons and forks suspended in the air. He lowered himself onto one knee before Alina, opened a small velvet box, and spoke in a clear voice that needed no microphone. The first time we belonged to each other, I carried a false name. Today, before the most honorable people I've ever had the privilege to serve, I'm not Ray, and I'm not Boss Barone. I'm only William, a man who owes you the truth and the rest of his life. Alina Monroe. Will you choose me again? Through tears and applause filling the entire dining room, and with Nana urging, "Say yes, child," before the boy's knee gives out, Alina bent down and placed her hand in his. Yes, I choose you. She didn't enter the most powerful family in Chicago through beauty or calculation. She entered through a meal she gave to an old woman the entire city had walked past. Kindness opened the door. Dignity kept her standing, and in the end, she was loved not because of who she was in the eyes of the world, but because she had never stopped seeing the human being inside those the world treated as invisible. This story now comes to an end, but it leaves us with a lesson that will never grow old. A person's worth isn't measured by the clothes they wear or the balance in their bank account, but by the way they treat those who can offer them nothing in return. One small meal given with a whole heart can save a soul that has been starving for human kindness for 6 long years. And genuine compassion is never given in vain. It always finds its way back to us, often in ways we could never have imagined. Deception, even when born from love or fear, can only be healed through truth and the courage to accept responsibility. If you believe kindness still has power in this world, please press like on today's video. Share this story with someone whose heart may need warmth, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the moving stories we bring to you every day. And what about you? How do you feel about Alina's journey? Have you ever stopped for someone the whole world walked past, or received an unexpected act of kindness that changed your life? Please share what is deepest in your heart in the comments below. We truly want to hear every one of your stories, because your words may become a small light for someone walking through darkness. Thank you for staying with us through today's story. We wish everyone watching this video abundant health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.